Honorable members, the prayer. Lord, the God of righteousness and truth, grant to our Queen and to our government, to members of the Legislative Assembly, and to all in positions of responsibility, the guidance of your Spirit. May they never lead the province wrongly through love of power or desire to please, but laying aside all private interests and prejudice, keep in mind their responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all. Honorable members, we will be now led in the singing of God Save the Queen by Ms. Brooklyn Allard. Please refrain from joining her. Please be seated.
Introduction of visitors, introduction of guests, ministerial statements.
The Honourable Minister of Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and began a period of Ottoman control over southeastern Europe, including Greece and Cyprus. Over time, there were several Greek uprisings against Ottoman control, and although they were unsuccessful, the dream of a free and independent Greece carried on. After 350 years of Ottoman control, a plan to rebel in the Peloponnese, the Danube, and Constantinople itself was ready and set for March 25th, 1821. This sparked the beginning of the Greek War of Independence, and the desire to live free inspired further revolts in Crete, Macedonia, and central Greece. In 1827, Britain, Russia, and France intervened to support the fight for independence, and at the Battle of Navarino, these allied forces ended Ottoman domination of the Aegean, and the Kingdom of Greece was established in 1832. Mr. Speaker, it gives me great honor and privilege to stand in the Assembly today to commemorate 200 years of Greek independence. To mark this special occasion, I've had the privilege of working with fellow Greek-Canadian politicians from across party lines to coordinate efforts on this important day. Today, Mr. Speaker, you will see the blue and white colors of Greece shine across the world. As well, right here at home in the city of Calgary and the city of Edmonton, both will fly the Greek flag outside City Hall, as will many other Canadian cities. In Australia, the Sydney Opera House will display blue and white colors. A 1,500 square foot Greek flag will be flown in Johannesburg. In the United States, the Los Angeles International LAX sign and Santa Monica Pier's Pacific Wheel will be lit up in blue, as will the CN Tower, Niagara Falls, Edmonton's high-level bridge, and other important landmarks. Mr. Speaker, I hope all members of the Assembly will join me in wishing Greeks here in Alberta and around the world a happy Independence Day and bicentennial.
Here, here. The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate this opportunity to rise and recognize the importance of this day for the Greek community in Alberta and indeed around the world. 200 years ago, after an 8-year-long struggle, Greece broke free from the rule of the Ottoman Empire that had lasted for 400 years, and which ultimately led to the collapse of that empire as it encouraged other smaller nations to fight for and win their independence as well. Now, we know that Alberta is home to 15,000 Albertans of Hellenic descent, who each bring their culture to life in Alberta here in many ways, from providing Greek language schools in both Edmonton and Calgary and showcasing their cultural food and dances at the annual Greek Festival in Calgary and at their pavilion at the Edmonton Heritage Festival. I'm personally proud to have the Hellenic Canadian community of Edmonton and region located here in my constituency of Edmonton City Centre, and I've enjoyed the opportunity to join them in the past to celebrate Greek Independence Day and indeed learn about their excellent Greek language school, which was established in 1983 and was the first of its kind to offer Greek education from kindergarten through grade 12 in Alberta. So I think we have a lot to thank Greece for. Delicious food, wonderful cultural dances and music, a rich mythology that has inspired endless literature, music, film, and indeed their contributions in areas like mathematics, philosophy, and indeed even perhaps the ability that I have to stand here today as a member of this Legislative Assembly, as Athens, Greece, is considered by many to have been the birthplace of democracy. So without those contributions, it may be well possible that we might not be standing in this room today. But today we all stand and we take some time to recognize the importance of Alberta's Greek community, the important role that Greeks have played in establishing democracy, and indeed join with so many others around the world that will be recognizing today as 200 years of Greek independence. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Edmonton, Glenora.
The last year has been really tough. Yesterday, we learned that 1 in 6 Alberta schools has a COVID outbreak or that they're on the watch list. This reminds many of us of the first time government abruptly closed schools this time last year. Let's remember that the Education Minister promised that school budgets and staffing would stay intact and simply transition online. But days later, she broke that promise, laying off Alberta's education support staff and cutting school budgets. This left students, families, and teachers to struggle through the remainder of the school year. That was the first closure. The minister promised that all staff would be rehired, but the budget is out, it's in black and white, and there are 2,000 fewer teachers and support staff than there were before the pandemic. In the summer, the UCP government decided that they would reopen schools with no new supports to improve safety or well-being. Schools were given some hand sanitizer and 2 masks per student. That's it. No new money for support staff, supplied teachers, smaller class sizes, or custodial services. So it wasn't a huge shock when many Alberta families opted for online learning and thousands of others didn't register their children at all. It's clear that many families didn't feel like this government was doing enough to protect and support their children. Then in November, secondary students were sent home. Grades 7 through 12 students were forced to learn online again. That was the second closure. And now, with 1 in 6 schools on the watch list are experiencing an outbreak, with many classes being forced to transition out of school, and with an entire Calgary high school closing its doors, many are feeling a sense of déjà vu. Governing, leading, is about choices. The government's choices have lasting impacts on Alberta students. And in 2 years, students and families will have a chance to make a choice about their government. Thank you.
The honourable member for Central, Peace, Notley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the peace country of which I'm proud to represent, the people are fair, straight-talking, and always willing to lend each other a helping hand. They are like the rest of rural Alberta, a key part of Alberta's social and economic fabric, and keen to grow and expand. From agriculture to resource development, Central Peace is full of growth and potential. As my constituents regularly remind me, to properly do a job, you need the proper tools. When I was asked to move some grain the other day, they were happy to lend me a shovel, an important tool for that job. And the development of rural Alberta is no exception in that tools are needed. As I've regularly said in this House before, services, programs, and infrastructure may cost a little more in rural Alberta, but they are just as critical to someone living in Cherry Point or Fox Creek as it is to someone living in Calgary or Edmonton. Recently, the MD of Spirit River is creating a new development zone south of the village of Rycroft by the grain elevators and train tracks. This is a welcome addition, as it will bring investment and growth to the region. To further enhance this project, they are planning on upgrading on Range Road 54 to connect that development to the highway system, making ease of travel and shipment of the goods and services the development zone will bring. Many municipalities have projects they're planning to help grow their economy and their community. A win for rural Alberta is a win for all of Alberta, and we should continue to encourage projects like these. This also applies to broadband infrastructure. In this world where farmers in the Peace Country sell their grain to buyers halfway around the world, access to reliable and fast internet services is key. Companies like TELUS are expanding broadband services to remote communities across the Peace Country, and areas such as Saddle Hills, and in fact all regions, are eager to expand broadband in their area. Another important consideration is keeping government offices in rural communities. In fact, I believe that with the new and better connectivity, we could move offices from cities to rural communities. Many services provided by government are done online and can be done anywhere in Alberta. In some rural communities, there are vacant government offices, so the infrastructure is there. I will continue to advocate for more services in rural Alberta rather than less. Rural Alberta is ready, willing, and able to be a benefit to all Albertans.
Hear, hear. The honourable member for Calgary-Curry has a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is an amazing project happening in Calgary-Curry, and while if I have anything to do with it, I'll do my part to make sure it happens. Now, as you know, Calgary-Curry is a very diverse constituency, and it is my job to represent and listen to everyone. As the MLA, I work hard to ensure that voices from all sides are heard, everyone, no matter who you are, how you vote, or how you live your life. And every once in a while, along comes a project that crosses all party lines, fully nonpartisan, and it is called the Imagine Sinalta project. This project is inclusive of everyone. It helps those less fortunate or marginalized. It supports those who experience discrimination of virtually any kind. And on top of that, it will inject close to $50 million into the economy. Now, Imagine Sinalta focuses on social programs and inclusive spaces for everything from language classes to pipe and smudging ceremonies. There are poverty reduction supports, early childhood development, social work, a commercial kitchen, employment training, and supports for at-risk seniors. They have already partnered with Calgary Alpha House, the Elizabeth Fry Society, and Hollowbone Healing Lodge, just to name a few, and I could go on and on. As an inner-city riding, we don't have local access to organizations like the Genesis Center or the YWCA, so this is needed. Sinalta itself is a neighborhood where 1 in 4 residents live on low income, 34% live alone, more than a quarter are residents, are new residents newly here in Canada. Imagine Sinalta services and supports are truly grassroots, but these services also already support surrounding ridings, Calgary as a whole, and in many ways, the work they do touches all corners of the province. So please go to www.sinalta.net/imagine and see for yourself how great this project is, and join me in helping make sure that we can get this project over the finish line. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Edmonton Meadow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, the no-plan budget of the UCP will pass, and Albertans will suffer as a result of the lack of vision from this government. In my constituency, we hear daily from Albertans who are concerned about the future of this province and who have little faith in this government, and those numbers are growing. Due to my role as the critic for multiculturalism, one of the issues that I hear about the most is the lack of action by the government to confront and tackle racism, which is why I was so disappointed to see even small decrease in the budget for multiculturalism. At a time when we are seeing rising acts of hate and racism, the minister chose to reduce this area of responsibility. Now, the minister likes to tell us that amazing work is being done, wonderful work is being done. The world is a lovely and happy place. But Mr. Speaker, where is the proof of this? The UCP stalled the Anti-Racism Advisory Council. We know they have a report with recommendations, but the minister has no timeline to make it public. What a waste. What an insult to Albertans who sat on the council for 2 years. What a slap in the face to the racialized and Indigenous Albertans whose lives are impacted by racism every day. The minister is proud of her budget, of her business plans, though I don't see anything to be proud of. A reduction in the budget to combat racism, no mention of anti-racism actions or plans at all, no tracking metrics, no accountability, nothing but hate, trust us. Mr. Speaker, racialized and Indigenous Albertans have heard those words before, and they want actions from this government. With the passage of this budget, it's clear there will be no...
The honourable member for Lethbridge East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since its inception in 1928, the Métis Nation of Alberta has been the Métis government for Métis Albertans. Governed by a provincial council, the MNA supports practices of transparency, accountability, and inclusiveness for Métis Albertans in the provincial and federal government policies processes. Just over 1 month ago, the MNA announced that it is consulting with Métis citizens across the province to draft a constitution that will help modernize its approach to self-government. This consultation is just one of the many steps they have taken since signing the historic Métis government recognition and self-government agreement with the federal government in June of 2019. Ever since then, the MNA have been working towards formal federal recognition of Métis Nation self-government in Alberta, including the creation of a constitution. This consultation is incredibly important for my riding, as we are part of the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, one of the largest Métis regions in the province. Lethbridge is also home to approximately 1,600 Métis peoples, a third of their Aboriginal population. I am incredibly honored by the openness, hard work, and encouragement that our local Métis Nation has extended to me. I'm also extremely happy to see our government working with the Métis across Alberta through our recently announced Bill 57, the Métis Settlements Amendment Act. This legislation proposes changes to modernize the Métis Settlements Act, increasing community sustainability and fiscal accountability. Updating this nearly 30-year-old legislation will set Métis settlements on the road to self-determination, to control their own destiny, and be financially independent, successful, and competitive. This bill will also reduce the role of the Minister of Indigenous Relations so settlement governments have greater authority and autonomy to make financial decisions. Supporting Alberta Métis communities is extremely important to this province, and I am happy to see a bright future on their horizon.
The honourable member for Highwood, perhaps the honourable member for Calgary-Pegan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Starting this coming Saturday, March 27th, and lasting 1 week until April 4th, the major Jewish holiday known as Passover will be celebrated. Passover honors the freedom and exodus of Jewish slaves from Egypt during the reign of Pharaoh Ramses II. Before the Jews were able to flee, Egypt was struck by 10 plagues, the last of which killed all the Egyptians' firstborn children. However, the Jewish families were passed over and spared from death, hence the name of the holiday, Passover. In Israel, Passover is a spring holiday which spans 7 days, with the first and last days being legal holidays, which involve holiday meals and special prayer services. Jews outside of Israel, however, celebrate the festival for 8 days. One of the big traditions is the Passover Seder, which marks the beginning of the holiday. The Seder is a tradition generally performed by multiple generations of a family and involves a retelling of the story of the liberation of the Israelites from slavery in ancient Egypt. Along with the retelling, the Seder also includes drinking 4 cups of wine, eating matzah, partaking of symbolic foods placed on the Passover Seder plate, and reeling in the celebration of freedom. With the holiday quickly approaching, I would like to wish any and all a happy Passover and hope we can all take in some time to realize how truly lucky we are to be free. While the last year has been tough, looking back at the origins of this holiday is a true reminder that freedom will always come, even in the darkest moments. I hope this holiday is a true reminder to everybody to be thankful for everything we have. To everyone celebrating, I wish you a happy Passover. Chag Sameach.
The honourable member for Edmonton Riverview.
Two competing perspectives have dominated the question of how to end human suffering. One understands human suffering as pathological, individual, and psychological, and as a responsibility of individual. The other as mainly the result of limited resources, oppression, and discrimination, the responsibility of society. Each perspective offers different approaches to address hardship. On the one hand, charity for those individuals deemed worthy of help, and on the other, improving the social conditions of all individuals to avoid hardship in the first place. Intervention versus prevention, charity versus solidarity. This government is clearly more invested in charity than solidarity and structural solutions. They would rather have a food bank than eliminate food insecurity. They would rather have short-term shelters than affordable housing. This government is more concerned with people abusing the system than they are with fixing that system. Food banks and shelters provide services for those in immediate need, but public policy should be directed not at merely reacting to poverty, but on actually ending poverty and fixing the system. We know that fixing the system is the only tenable solution to income inequality. We know that when income gaps increase, everyone is at risk of negative consequences. Social problems emerge at greater frequency, people experience poor health outcomes, live shorter lives, and business and the economy suffer. Albertans should not suffer in poverty. The gap between the richest and poorest Albertans should not continue to widen. The most compassionate and logical response to suffering should not stop at charity, but extend to justice. I was proud to be a part of a government that cut child poverty in half. I was proud to be the Minister of Seniors and Housing when we made a historic $1.2 billion investment in affordable housing. COVID-19 has exacerbated issues of poverty, and we need an Alberta government which confronts systemic issues.
Honourable members, oral question period, and the Leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition has the call.
Mr. Speaker, Alberta is in a jobs emergency. Today, there are 240,000 Albertans looking for work and desperate for a credible plan for the future. Mr. Speaker, despite all appearances, the Premier's biggest failure is not today's court decision. It is the families he forgot and the jobs he failed to create while distracted by these losing battles. For 2 years, this Premier has been damaging efforts to diversify our economy while refusing to address climate change. Now he says he'll start making a plan tomorrow. To the Premier, what happens now?
The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the NDP continue to lie to Albertans. The Premier has not said that he will just start to work on climate. In fact, our province has been working on climate longer than any province in Confederation, Mr. Speaker. And our government has been working on climate since we got here 18 months ago, Mr. Speaker, starting with the Technology Innovation and Emission Reduction Program, Mr. Speaker, which has saved industry 90% while it's still achieving the same results as the federal program, Mr. Speaker. That's real action. And a stark contrast from that member when she was the Premier who brought in a carbon tax, Mr. Speaker, that she never told Albertans about, and all it did was cause economic pain and no environmental gain.
The Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, Albertans have been paying Ottawa for 14 months under this government's leadership. The Premier's lost tens of thousands of jobs while leading Canada in climate denial. Quote, investors and customers are increasingly looking for jurisdictions to have a framework in place that reconciles resource development and climate change. This does not yet exist here, Mr. Speaker. That was Teck 1 year ago, cancelling their Frontier project and 7,000 jobs with it. Why won't this Premier admit that this fight, one he torqued up, one he has now lost, is costing Albertans their jobs?
The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the member from Edmonton Strathcona still standing side by side with Justin Trudeau. She did that when she was the Premier. She's doing that while she's the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker, betting against Albertans, Mr. Speaker, and moving forward with policies when it came to climates that hurt Albertans, Mr. Speaker. Shame on her and her party for that, Mr. Speaker. She brought in an NDP carbon tax, Mr. Speaker, that cost more than the federal carbon tax, Mr. Speaker, and we got rid of that carbon tax as we promised Albertans. And let's be clear, Albertans fired her and her party because of that carbon tax, Mr. Speaker, and Albertans can rest assured this government will never bring back the NDP carbon tax.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Now, Mr. Speaker, Alberta needs its own climate plan, but instead this Premier chose to send Alberta's tax dollars to Ottawa. Now, a Made in Alberta plan requires precise policy based on refined engagement with multiple stakeholders across the entirety of our economy. To protect and enhance our economic growth, it must be informed, it must be strategic and versatile, not this Premier's strong suit, I'm afraid. So why did the Premier waste 2 years ignoring a job that everyone knew was his all along?
Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, that member when she was Premier, when asked about her signature policy, her carbon tax, how much emissions it would reduce, she could not answer the question, Mr. Speaker, because their program was all about economic pain and punishing everyday Albertans, Mr. Speaker. This Premier and this government have brought forward an innovative program that focuses on innovation and working with our industry, Mr. Speaker, that has created 9,000 jobs last year alone, Mr. Speaker, and actually reduces emissions, Mr. Speaker, because again, we're focused on solving the problem. That member was focused on taxing Albertans, Mr. Speaker, and rest assured, we will never bring back her punishing carbon tax.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition for a second set of questions.
Well, we'll just sit here while Albertans pay it to Justin Trudeau. Now, yesterday's update from Dr. Hinshaw was deeply concerning to all Albertans. More than 1,400 new cases in just 8 days. 1 in 5 cases is now the highly contagious variant. Now, the government had to walk back its plans for Step 3, and doctors are now warning of a third wave. Yesterday, I asked the Premier for information contained in the AHS model, or as he put it, early warning system, for 3 weeks out. Albertans want to know the forecasted case counts, the forecasted hospitalizations, the forecasted R value. Why is the Premier hiding this vital information from Albertans?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Nothing is being hidden. We continue to do, and by the way, the member is talking about not model, but about a simple projection. We know from a certain amount of case counts that might be in a certain date, and 14 days later, we'll be able to figure out that there could be, for example, if there are 1,000 new daily cases, we know that 2 weeks later there could be approximately about 40 new hospital beds for those patients who are contracted COVID, Mr. Speaker. So she's talking about simple projections. It's not, and they don't consider vaccinations as well, Mr. Speaker, and some of them are really about promoting COVID. Really what the NDP is doing is oh, sorry, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're just looking for the information that the government has. Right now, hospitals are reopening COVID wards, preparing ICU plans, and redesigning isolation protocols. Dr. Darren Markland says ICU staffing is being increased, quote, as we look to expand into the recovery rooms for barrack-style management of people on ventilators and high-flow oxygen. Premier, of the people in ICU today, 88% of them are under 65 years old. So why won't the Premier release the AHS forecast on hospitalizations and the expected age of patients expected to be impacted by that?
Honourable Minister of Health.
Speaker, provided that information, and AHS is going to continue to do that so they can make sure they have a 14-day window when they know from the daily new case count and how many beds are going to be needed 14 days later. They'll continue to do that to continue to make sure that the additional capacity as well, the surge capacity they built up throughout 2020 is there on a flexible basis to be able to reply and respond as we might have cases increase, Mr. Speaker. But this is really about the NDP wanting us to go to a lockdown that we've seen throughout the rest of the world and chasing zero rather than responding responsibly to the
Leader of the Opposition.
We're just asking for the forecast information that has not been released to Albertans. Now, yesterday the Premier seemed open to reconsidering his benchmarks for reopening. Now, I would argue it should also work in the other direction too. Yesterday, Dr. Hinshaw said, quote, what we know is that in other places where variant strains have become dominant, additional restrictions have been required. Mr. Speaker, today the variant is 20% of all cases. In a recent outbreak in a single venue down in Calgary, over half were the variant. So is the Premier considering the possibility of re-establishing restrictions, and if so, will he do so on the basis of COVID numbers?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
We've answered that many times, actually, Mr. Speaker, and our press availabilities in this chamber as well, Mr. Speaker, that as we ease restrictions, it'd be based on hospitalizations, but if there was a need for the imposition of any new restrictions, it would be based on a leading indicator, a case count, Mr. Speaker, that we could see on a daily basis and an increasing daily day count. As we perhaps could see a weekly average of a certain percentage that Dr. Henshaw would come to us with that concern and make recommendation for the imposition of further measures. But, Mr. Speaker, we continue to work with her office and continue to respond responsibly to the crisis.
Member for Gold Bar.
It's become clearer than ever this week that the government has no plan and is unwilling to be accountable to Albertans on matters of climate change or the environment. Greenhouse gas reduction should be a key measurement to show that the government is taking action. So naturally, this Premier and his minister removed any measure or tracking of this from their annual business plan. Will the Premier explain to Albertans why we no longer get to know if we're actually reducing emissions? Isn't that something that we should care about?
Minister of Environment and Parks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do appreciate the question. Let me be clear. The Technology Innovation and Emission Reduction Program alone is on track to reduce 30 megatons across our system in GHG emissions. That's a stark contrast from that member and his party, who, when they were in power, Mr. Speaker, couldn't even name one GHG emission that their program was reducing, Mr. Speaker. Again, we're focused on working with our industry to innovate our way through the climate change challenge that the world faces, Mr. Speaker. And let me assure Albertans, unlike that member, we won't focus on bringing in punishing taxes that hurt them each and every day.
The honourable member for Goldbar.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Speaker, his plan is a stark contrast to ours, which reduced 50 megatons. That's 20 megatons more than he said his plan is going to reduce. But greenhouse gas emissions are not the only environmental concern in which the provincial government wants to avoid accountability from Albertans. Yesterday, the Premier claimed that he never removed any environmental monitoring rules, even though a report from the University of the Calgary School of Public Policy made clear that he actually removed 3 times more the regulations than any other province. Can the Premier explain how these headlines could possibly be helpful as we attempt to draw international investment to our province?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Parks.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the NDP is yet again lying over and over. No monitoring was removed by the Alberta government, Mr. Speaker, and the Premier was clear about that yesterday. But back to GHG emissions, Mr. Speaker. The Alberta government is on track, Mr. Speaker, to be at 240 tons, Mr. Speaker. And just so you know, those following along at home, and for the member from Edmonton Goldbar, that's 20 megatons less than the NDP, Mr. Speaker. That's a real program that was not focused on punishing everyday Albertans, Mr. Speaker. And again, I want to assure Albertans, we will do what is needed to protect them and protect their pocketbook, unlike the NDP.
The honourable member for Goldbar.
It is amazing that this minister signed an order last year removing environmental restrictions and then has the gall to stand up and say that we are lying about it. The investment advisor Morningstar was clear this week about the damage done by this government to our international reputation. It says that the Alberta government has become the oil patch's own worst enemy by weakening environmental monitoring and oversight. We've lost tens of thousands of jobs in the energy sector. Is the Premier willing to be humble for once and admit that his failed environmental policies and his work to undo environmental progress has actually cost jobs and not
the Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, again, orders were signed to slow down, not monitoring, Mr. Speaker, but the recovering of monitoring, Mr. Speaker, not stop monitoring, and the chief scientist confirms that no monitoring was stopped by the Alberta government, Mr. Speaker, and that's what the NDP is lying about. But here's the difference, Mr. Speaker. They stand up in this House each and every day and pretend that they stand up for workers, except for one industry. Did you notice that, Mr. Speaker? Except for oil and gas workers, Mr. Speaker. They wanted us to send oil and gas workers into the pandemic without helping energy companies put in the safety protocols for them. Well, shame on them, Mr. Speaker. We stand with every industry in this province, including the oil and gas industry.
The honourable member for Calgary Mountain View.
The government has introduced a motion in this House seeking to recoup the costs of their failed gamble on Donald Trump's re-election. There's one glaring problem. The Premier, the Finance Minister, and the Energy Minister have repeatedly rejected calls to release the details of the deal made by this government and the true cost to Alberta taxpayers. Last night, we attempted to amend the motion to call for full disclosure of the cost. It was promptly voted down by the government members. To the Premier, how can we possibly get our money back if you won't even come clean with Albertans about how much we've lost?
The Honourable Minister of Finance, President Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've been perfectly transparent with Albertans with respect to KXL. In fact, in Budget 2021, we devoted a full page providing details and the exposure, financial exposure of the government of Alberta with respect to KXL, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, the NDP simply appear to have not read the budget. Mr. Speaker, it's clear in Budget 2021.
For Calgary Mountain View.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's a pretty creative definition of transparent. Calgary lost 1,000 jobs last week at Cenovus. There are more than 200,000 Albertans looking for work right now, and we have the second highest unemployment rate in the country. We know the government has lost at least $1.3 billion on their bet on Donald Trump being re-elected. We expect that the numbers will grow and that the Premier is hiding the true cost of his failed gamble. Premier, you don't think billions of dollars in investment would have been better spent on something that would actually get Albertans back to work?
The Honourable Minister of Finance and President of the Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that the KXL pipeline if and when completed, will provide $30 billion of revenue to Albertans over 2 decades, Mr. Speaker. That's in contrast to the NDP's crude by rail effort, Mr. Speaker, which risked $3.7 billion to move 120,000 barrels per day for only 2 years, Mr. Speaker. At the same time, they brought in curtailment, a competing policy which guaranteed a failure of crude by rail.
Honourable member for Calgary Mountain View.
Mr. Speaker, their failed bet is in contrast to the 2 pipelines our government got approved. Last week, the Premier called me an Edmonton socialist when I asked him about his failed job record. For the record, I live in Calgary and represent the fine constituents of Calgary Mountain View. I was elected to support my constituents, and what they need right now are jobs. To the Premier, did you resort to names because you failed to create any jobs, because you have no economic plan for our future, or because you would rather level insults than admit to losing billions of dollars on your failed gamble on the U.S. election?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would certainly agree with the member opposite that jobs are critically important for Albertans right across the province today, including Calgary. And Mr. Speaker, that's why we were the first province to roll out an economic recovery plan. That's a plan with substantive details, a plan that's also a work in progress that we're building out month after month, Mr. Speaker. On top of that, we are now seeing projections that Alberta will lead the nation in terms of economic recovery in 2021. Conference Board of Canada, Bank of Montreal, National Bank, and now Desjardins Bank.
The Honourable member for Central Peace Notley has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, the government announced the creation of the Digital Overdose Response System that will allow the summoning of emergency response to a location if the person becomes unconscious. Yesterday, the Alberta NDP made serious allegations of scandal outside of the protection of this chamber, suggesting we cancelled an Alberta Health Services program to fund politically connected individuals instead. To the Associate Minister of Mental Health and Addictions, is any of what the members opposite said yesterday true?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member for the question. Absolutely not, Mr. Speaker. And it is disturbing to see the NDP, as we've seen for the last year from the NDP, playing bare-knuckled politics and spin, in this case over the lives of those who are struggling with addiction. And Tuesday's announcement was welcome news for our province and for those who are struggling. And the NDP, as we've seen for the last year, every time online that they're lying, refused to issue an apology.
The Honourable Member for Central Peace Notley.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you, Minister. Given that the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions is working tirelessly to increase access to supports available in our province, and given that concocting unfounded scandal can be dangerous for a marginalized population, and given that the members opposite continue to push for a previous research program from Alberta Health Services that would have only been able to support 15 people at the time of the launch, to the same minister, can you tell us about the new life-saving system?
Order. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The previous line was a $1 million research study, which was going to initially study a telephone line for 15 people in Calgary. And the doctor in charge of that program has said himself that there was never a working overdose app that had been developed and scrapped. Our system allows people using drugs alone to summon emergency response to their location if they become unconscious. Most importantly, it provides information on local addiction recovery supports and services to help ensure that people have the information they need to find long-term recovery.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Minister. Given that Aware 360 is an Alberta-based company with a long track record of keeping lone workers safe in risky environments, and given that the company has had a government contract in Alberta for more than a decade, including under the previous government, and given that it was the former government that suggested to the researchers that they use Aware 360 for this program, to the same minister, can you please highlight why this company was chosen?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Aware 360 is a great Alberta-based technology company that has been keeping people safe for decades. It's their technology systems, professional monitoring platforms, and relationships with STARS, EMS, and other emergency services that make them a valued partner. And we're thrilled to have a company with their experience and their knowledge at the table for this important issue.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, there was hope that an agri-stability deal could be signed to support Alberta farmers. And it was my sincere hope that the UCP would have put politics aside and did what was best, and listened to the producers who have come forward with a clear and unified voice of the need of increasing economic security in agriculture. To the Minister of Agriculture, why did the government not listen to these producers, rural Albertans and farmers, and finally sign on to the whole deal? Why not sign on to the compensation rate? How much money was left on the table?
Well, the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and for the member opposite for that very important question. The federal government had $170 million on the table for changes to agri-stability, something that we at the province of Alberta fought very hard to get. We had a vote at the FPT meeting with the majority of provinces actually signing on agreeing that that $170 million should go out to our farmers. Unfortunately, the federal government decided to take $75 million of that $170 off the table, but it is something that we are going to continue to fight for to be able to get the right compensation rate for our farmers.
The honourable member for Edmonton Manning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given it was because the provinces didn't sign on to the compensation rate changes, and given that most involved in agri-stability negotiations believe longer-term changes need to be made, and thankfully this proposal only goes till 2023, given the Ontario Minister of Agriculture said that we cannot wait multiple years to make it perfect, and I actually agree with the Ontario Minister, who is a Conservative. And given this issue should not be partisan anyway, and it should be doing what's best for farmers, to the Minister, why didn't the government cut off the politics, sign on to the full federal proposal today so producers can have access to all the funding and supports from the federal government?
The Honourable Minister of Ag.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And unfortunately, there is politics involved. And I think the NDP opposite with the NDP-Trudeau alliance that seems to be alive and well these days, hopefully they could be able to get that $12 million that Alberta was actually owed for this compensation change that the federal government chose to take off the table. So that is something that we are going to continue to push. And if the opposition with their good friends in the Trudeau Liberals can try to get that funding for Alberta farmers, that'd be great.
The honourable member.
Well, given that the money is for farmers, and given the UCP answer to important questions in agriculture rarely involves anything beyond name-calling, 7-year-old talking points, and patting themselves on the back while they fail to create jobs and diversify our economy, and given that producers are tired of politics, are done with being taken for granted, and do not wish to be used as bargaining chips in some sort of power play with Ottawa, to the Minister of Agriculture, why are we even still talking about agri-stability today? How come the UCP took so long not to sign on to the whole deal? Does this government seriously believe that political bargaining engagement be done on the back of farmers?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture and Forestry.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I do like this version of NDP that actually are standing up for a fair deal for the province of Alberta. We do transfer about $20 billion net every year from the province of Alberta to Ottawa. This was $12 million that we could actually be able to get back. Unfortunately, the federal government chose not to do that. They took the $170 million. They took 75 of that $170 million off the table. But it is something, Mr. Speaker, that we are going to continue to fight and advocate for business risk management reforms for our farmers and ranchers across the province.
The Honourable, the Opposition House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, last Friday, the portal to apply for the critical worker benefit closed. Employers had until last night to finish up applications on behalf of their employees. So by now, the government should have a pretty good idea of how many Albertans have applied for this benefit. A benefit, I would remind you, that took the government 287 days to finally launch, 287 days after the federal funds were first announced, hundreds of days longer than most provinces. Can the minister explain how many applications are being processed, and when will Albertans know if they've been approved or denied?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Member for the question. The Honourable Member is quite right. The private sector portal closed last week. We received 12,351 applications in that portal. We're processing them through that right now. We expect to have them processed within the next couple of weeks. I will add, though, Mr. Speaker, there is a separate portal set up under healthcare because this is being delivered through 5 different departments. That portal does not close until the end of this month, and they'll be processed into April. But we are on track to be able to getting the money out to Albertans in this important benefit.
Member for Edmonton Millwoods.
Given that our offices have received hundreds of calls and emails from frustrated Albertans who did not qualify for this thrown-together benefit and who are looking for answers, that includes employers who were told their employees did not qualify simply because of the type of product they sold, and given that this government is drawing lines between workers who mostly bake bread versus those who mostly bake pastries, which would be laughable if it wasn't so indicative of how badly the government has bungled this program, to the minister, can you tell us, of those 12,351 applications, how many were then denied the critical worker benefit by your government? And if you aren't able to tell us, will you table that information?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Immigration.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, our government appreciates all the work that everyone has done during the course of this pandemic. As the honourable member knows, over 80% of the workforce continue to work during the pandemic and were deemed as essential services. Our government chose to focus on those who played critical roles in supporting healthcare, social services, education, as well as those who supported our food supply chains, from grocery store clerks to those working in meatpacking plants and supporting medicine supply chains. And I'll get to the other answer in the next.
The honourable member.
Given that the minister's understanding of critical roles seems to be very far from what's happened on the ground in the front lines in our province, given that the workers and employers trying to apply for the critical worker benefit described it as unfair, confusing, frustrating, and a host of other terms, some of them unparliamentary, to the minister, after all this, after the mess that's been caused, after needless delay that surely has hurt Alberta local economies, what do you say to our province's critical workers who still don't have their money? And what do you say to the many critical workers who, because of your choices, will never get a dime of this important program?
Honourable the Minister of Labour and Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, I say thank you to all the Alberta workers who continue to work during the pandemic, and I say a special thank you to the critical workers who were identified in this program. Mr. Speaker, our province, like other provinces across the entire country, looked at the federal funding, and given the limited funding, we identified critical workers and we wanted to say thank you to them, but we're saying thank you to everyone. Mr. Speaker, we are putting out nearly $500 million, $465 million into the pockets of Albertans, and the details, once we finalize the program, we can provide to the member opposite.
The honourable member for Central, Peace Notley.
Today, the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry met with his federal, provincial and territorial colleagues to discuss changes to agri-stability. Leading up to this meeting, we saw a lot of rhetoric from the federal government as they attacked the prairie provinces for trying to do their due diligence and analyze the deal on the table. We even hear the members opposite mislead Albertans by saying that the government refused to sign on to the deal. To the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry, were you able to reach a deal on agri-stability?
Well, the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, we did get a good deal for the province of Alberta today at the FPT meeting. We were trying to get a better deal, Mr. Speaker, but it was something that the federal government removed $75 million off the table for compensation for farmers. So that was something that was obviously very disappointing. There are lots of provinces that actually had a majority vote, and the majority of the agriculture production across the country and a majority of the provinces that partook in the FPT meeting today actually voted in favor of it. However, the federal government chose not to do it.
The honourable member for Central Peace Notley.
Thank you, Minister. Given that the federal government's proposal for agri-stability included the removal of the reference margin limit and an increase in the compensation rate from 70 to 80%, given that the federal government has publicly committed $170 million to fund both of the proposed changes to agri-stability, and given that Alberta's government was fighting for the best deal possible for Albertans, can a minister update the House on how these negotiations went and what deal were struck for Alberta's farmers and ranchers?
Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We did have the RML, or reference margin limit, has been removed. That is something that will help that 3.6% of farmers that currently get benefits from agri-stability, that will actually increase that number, we hope. And it is something that those agri-stability changes of the RML will actually be retroactive to last year as well. So that is some good news for farmers. But, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, the federal government left $75 million off the table for supports for our farmers and ranchers, and that's something that we're going to continue to push for.
The honourable member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for the answer. Given a deal on agri-stability is good news for producers in the province, as it will help offset large declines in farm income, especially during a pandemic. But given this deal is really only a band-aid approach and does nothing to fix the major problems within agri-stability, And given that this program continually fails to support most producers in the province, to the same minister, what are you doing to ensure that we have a strong set of business risk management programs that support all producers?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2023 is the next CAP program, or the 5-year business risk management program that happens with a joint agreement between the provinces and the federal government. So the negotiations for that new deal is well underway, and something that when we talk to farmers and ranchers when it comes to income supports, which agri-stability is supposed to be, they've said they want a program that's bankable, timely, and predictable. That's why we're actually developing a margin-based insurance program, something that we think will be able to replace agri-stability in the long term, helping our farmers out when they actually need support.
The Honourable Member, order. The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rising case counts, variant cases spreading, and hospitalization rates on the rise. Albertans are rightly concerned about the potential severity of the third wave of this pandemic. We're back to new case levels that we haven't seen since mid-January. But this health minister still won't come clean with Albertans. It's been a long year. Albertans deserve better. The public deserves to know what this government knows. It's time for the secrecy to end. We know this health minister has got it. He just admitted so today. So why won't he release his internal projections for a potential third wave of the pandemic? Why won't Albertans get this information?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, none of that is true. This is the false narrative that the member has been trying to perpetuate that is completely false, that we are being secretive. We are providing more transparency to Albertans about our numbers and about our response to the pandemic than other provinces. We're going to continue to do that, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to provide that information to Albertans so they understand the spread of COVID and variant cases in the community and our response to the pandemic.
No order is noted at 2:20. The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, given that we had nearly 700 new cases yesterday, and given that hospitals are gearing up for COVID variant cases and doctors are worried that they don't have the resources or capacity to properly prevent the spread of these more contagious strains, and given that many have been working full out for a year in unimaginable circumstances, and yet the finance minister had the audacity this week to call on them to put the health of Albertans first. Will either this minister or the premier apologize to these very frontline workers who we will be relying on to save lives if they should steer us into a third wave?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Speaker, we're going to continue to track the variants in our community and the spread of the variants in our community, as well as the wild strain, and continue to make sure that we have all of the resources that AHS and our frontline healthcare workers have to be able to respond to the pandemic, including our physicians and other health professionals, that all of those folks have the resources that they need to be able to protect the lives of Albertans against the spread of COVID in our community, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, given that with these occurrences, COVID-19 vaccine is the best way for us to end the nightmare that has been this past year, and given that we need all Alberta seniors vaccinated as quickly as possible, but given that I continue to hear from a number of seniors and Albertans who have mobility issues, who are housebound, who are unable to go to a clinic to get a vaccine. To the minister, what are we to tell these Albertans who are housebound? Do you have a plan in place for vaccinations for those who are housebound and unable to attend an appointment at a vaccination clinic?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, first, I have the similar frustration with the vaccines, Mr. Speaker, as those Albertans, because we should actually be having to cohort Albertans. Big part of the problem is that we have been provided a very small amount of vaccines throughout February and March. And it's been frustrating for Albertans as the federal government has failed to be able to deliver the vaccines that we needed in February and March. We're only now starting to get those vaccines. This is a marathon, Mr. Speaker, and the federal government has caused us to start the marathon an hour and a half late. But we'll continue to make sure those vaccines get out to Albertans as quickly as possible.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton, Castle Downs.
Community leagues are tired of being ignored by the UCP, so tired that these traditionally nonpartisan groups have come to us for help. They brought us a letter signed by 150 community leagues across Alberta that decried the 50% cut to the Community Facility Enhancement Program, or CFEP. But when we brought up their concerns yesterday in question period, the Premier suggested it was fear and smear. But Mr. Speaker, on page 64 of the government's own estimates document, you see $18.5 million allocated for CFEP. Under the NDP, CFEP got $38 million. So, to the Premier, will you admit you were wrong and apologize to these community leagues?
The Honourable Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism and the Status of Women.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. And it always warms my heart to be able to talk about community associations, community leagues, the volunteers around the province. And every time we have this conversation, it just highlights some of the incredible work that is going on. And especially warms my heart to hear from the member of Edmonton, Castle Downs, caring so much about stakeholders. I just wish she could get her facts right. To say that there's been a 50% cut is absolutely false. I'm sure I'm going to get an opportunity to answer another question.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Castle Downs.
Given that the Premier said, quote, all of the above is false and misleading when asked about the 50% cut to cultural grants, but given that the Premier is either deliberately misleading the House in his horrendous cut or doesn't actually understand his own budget. Either way, it's deeply concerning. And given that the Premier then referred to another program in his answer that community leagues cannot access, will the Premier admit he doesn't actually care about these groups, the vital work they do in their communities, and pledge to do better by them and reverse the cuts to the grant program that they rely on?
The Honourable Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism.
Well, I would like to say, first of all, thank you so much to the communities across this province, the incredible work all of us have seen, the absolute incredible work that our volunteers have done, especially during the COVID crisis. So perhaps we should start first by thanking them. Again, and I'm happy to say these numbers again as many times as you like to ask me, so this is great because it elevates community in our province. My department has committed $37.1 million to the Community Initiatives Program, which actually the communities, all communities can apply for, and there is $18.5 million still in CFIP, and I'm looking forward to the community leagues applying for those
The
dollars.
Honourable Member for Edmonton Castle Downs.
Given that the Alberta's community leagues have been ignored by the government, and that's why they turn to us for help, and given that these organizations are struggling greatly to fundraise and support their work during the economic downturn and COVID-19 pandemic, and given that when they went public with their concerns, all this Premier could do was level childish insults at them and the work that they do, and given that this is throwing salt to the wound, will the Premier grow up, do the right thing, and restore funding to community grants to what it was under the NDP government today?
The Honourable Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism.
Mr. Speaker, why let the facts get in the way when you can just disparage anybody who you feel like casting aspersions on? How much fun? Well, let's go back to the facts, actually. We have temporarily put money into CFIP programs because right now, when we consulted with the organizations, these programs are so important to the communities. And actually, right now, that is the most important thing because operations are just as important as building a roof or putting in a parking lot or any of those things. And quite frankly, those folks who need those operational dollars, they came to us and we delivered.
The Honourable Member for West Yellowhead.
Mr. Speaker, while COVID-19 might not be done with rural Alberta is done with COVID-19. In December, our government announced further restrictions to bend the curve, to reduce the R value, and help Albertans protect the integrity of the healthcare system. Now, almost 4 months later, my constituents tell me that a few weeks shutdown is becoming extremely frustrating in communities with little to no COVID cases. To the Minister of Health, how long will it be until my residents, my business owners, and my communities can get back to normal?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we know that Albertans are frustrated, but we also know that they don't want the roller coaster of easing and tightening restrictions. We're much more open here in Alberta than we are than other provinces are, like BC, Ontario, and Quebec. The fact is that we wouldn't be in this situation, though, if the federal government had managed to secure enough supply as other countries did. And Alberta is working hard to get all of our doses into the arms of Albertans, and every dose that's administered in Alberta means that we're closer to getting back to normal. We held up our end of the bargain, Mr. Speaker. It's time for the Prime Minister to do the same.
Member for West Yellowhead.
Mr. Speaker, given that almost 2 months ago, Albertans were provided with a step-by-step roadmap to get to the other side of COVID-19, and given that my constituents are now asking why this roadmap appears to be changing, and given that the current uncertainty is leading to more anxiety, stress, despair, and yes, even fear, and given that most Albertans believe that we will be dealing with COVID-19 and its variants of concern for years to come, to the Minister, is there still a roadmap to get our lives back to normal, or are we going to have to continue with the uncertainty?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to be clear, when the policy, the path forward was announced in January, we announced that hospitalizations must be 300 and declining before we were to move into step 3. And cases and hospitalizations are rising in every part of the province. That's why we had delayed moving into step 3. Hospitalization benchmarks chart a path forward to carefully restart businesses and activities that people depend on. The fastest way to get back to normal is to limit spread and prevent the health system from being overwhelmed while we vaccinate Albertans as quickly as possible.
The honourable member.
Given that tensions are rising in rural Alberta where even face coverings are a point of contention, and given that I've told my constituents that our government has aimed to protect our healthcare capacity, and given that for the past number of weeks there have been very few COVID-19 cases in any of my communities, and given that my constituency spans 4.5 hours from one end to the other, so 20 cases across such a vast area should not be as concerning as 20 cases within 10 blocks in Edmonton. Again to the Minister, at what point will a regional approach be considered which takes into account the reality that rural Alberta is not burdening our healthcare system?
The Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And COVID is present in all parts of the province, urban and rural. Currently, 7 of the 10 areas of the province with the highest number of active cases are actually in rural areas. Today, there are COVID patients in hospital from every zone in the province. A regional approach could mean increased measures as well, to point that out to the Chamber, increased measures in some areas with higher transmission. We're exploring the effectiveness of updating restrictions on a regional basis, and we will continue to update Albertans.
Edmonton Riverview is next.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government's review of supervised consumption services last year was never anything more than a political smear tactic. But now, one of the UCP's hand-picked panelists, Dr. Rob Tanguay, has published a paper in the Canadian Journal of Psychiatry. Dr. Tanguay reports that these services have saved lives and led to more than 10,000 referrals of Albertans into addiction treatment. Has the Associate Minister of Health read Dr. Tanguay's paper, and when will he expand services to supervised consumption sites?
Minister of Health.
First of all, Mr. Speaker, his name is Tanguay. And we will continue to consult with Dr. Tanguay. He has been a helpful voice for our government. We will continue to make sure, again, this is the NDP's ideology in trying to stop recovery from even being a part of the spectrum of services that are provided to those who suffer from addiction. We reject that, Mr. Speaker. We see that harm reduction is one of the tools that's included in the spectrum of opportunities to provide care to patients who suffer from addiction, but we will add a recovery focus as well, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Edmonton Riverview.
Given that Dr. Tanguay writes that 75 previous studies have concluded that supervised consumption saves lives, reduces the spread of the disease, and connects people with treatment, and given, he writes, and I quote, "Despite this wealth of encouraging evidence, the utility of Alberta's SCS has met skepticism from policymakers, with consequent fears among harm reduction advocates of SCS funding cuts or program cancellation. Will the minister listen to his own hand-picked expert and expand access to supervised consumption in Alberta?"
The Honourable Minister of Health.
We will continue to do, as I just said, Mr. Speaker, that we will have a full spectrum of care for patients who suffer from addiction. And that means that harm reduction will be one of those tools, but that we will also add a recovery-oriented focus to the spectrum of services to those who suffer from addiction, because that was ignored by the NDP due to their ideology, Mr. Speaker.
Member.
Given that recovery was always part of our plan, and given that overdose deaths have almost doubled under this minister's watch, with hundreds upon hundreds of preventable deaths, and given that Dr. Tanguay's study found a direct correlation between the decline in supervised consumption usage in 2020 and the shocking increase in overdose deaths, when will the Minister of Health put aside the Premier's personal prejudices and expand access to these proven services and spare more Alberta families to the preventable death of a loved one?
Minister of Health.
This is, again, the ideology of the NDP, Mr. Speaker, in looking at adding recovery to the spectrum when we deal with those who suffer from addiction, that is somehow zero-sum for them, that we are somehow taking away. But there is still harm reduction that's going to be available to Albertans who suffer from addiction, Mr. Speaker. But we will also add a focus to recovery opportunities for Albertans who suffer from addiction. That's the threat that they see because of their ideology.
For Calgary McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many Albertans get assistance to attend colleges such as Bow Valley and Columbia College for English as second language and basic skills training upgrades. Recently, these Albertans have gotten tax receipts that include what the students has received as a living allowance and the fee that the government paid to the college for students, which adds between $20,000 to $40,000 to their incomes. This causes many to lose their low-income benefits like child benefit. Why is this Minister of Finance trying to push low-income people off their benefits? Will he take steps to correct this today?
The Honourable Minister of Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for the very important question. Of course, through student aid, the Government of Alberta provides a number of benefits and supports to all Albertans, and primarily low-income Albertans, to help them access post-secondary education, which is critically important as well. I know the member commented on ESL programs. We've recently announced an expansion of ESL programs, primarily in partnership with the Healthcare Aid program at a number of our colleges, which is helping more Albertans access important post-secondary opportunities.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-McCall.
Given that question was about learner benefit and not about post-secondary, and given that because of this UCP government, many of these low-income students who are seeking to learn English or to train or upgrade their skills are now being deprived access to critical benefits like child care, dental care, and drug benefits. And given that this government claims to support students seeking to upgrade skill, why does the Minister of Finance want to make it harder for newcomers and low-income Albertans to upgrade their skills? Will he stop this horrible policy?
The Honourable Minister of Advanced Education.
Well, thank you again, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to comment again and just inform the House of the number of different programs and grants and bursaries that are available to support low-income learners. And furthermore, as well, in 2019, changes to the maintenance grant were made. The maintenance grant was previously not income tested. The new iteration is income tested, and that's allowing us to reach 6,400 more low-income learners and help them access post-secondary.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-McCall.
Given that this policy will impact many newcomers to Canada in ESL or skill training, and given that these receipts will result in nothing but depriving these low-income students of access to drug coverage, childcare, dental benefits, just to name a few. And given that since this was an issue that the NDP government addressed, this is something that this UCP government can correct today. Will the Minister of Finance commit that he will undo this policy to ensure that no students will lose access to their benefit? Again, the question is about
the Honourable Minister of Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I was mentioning a moment ago, the previous iteration of the maintenance grant that was available was not income tested. And of course, our government recognizes the importance of providing financial assistance to low-income Albertans to allow them to access post-secondary education. Income testing, the maintenance grant, and other changes, as I mentioned earlier, are allowing us to reach 6,400 more low-income Albertans and help them to access post-secondary education. As well, within Alberta 2030, we're looking at other measures to support foundational.
Well, Member for Lethbridge East.
Mr. Speaker, accessing the most up-to-date COVID-19 information, resources, and guidelines can be a challenging process for many Albertans. There are a lot of websites full of information and links to many resources, and I've heard from my constituents that the information overload can make it difficult to access the simple information they are looking for. To the Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism and the Status of Women, as new COVID information is released constantly, what resources are available for those in Lethbridge who have been having difficulties accessing the information they need?
The Honourable the Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism, Status of Women.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's absolutely imperative that Albertans can access information about COVID-19 and vaccine in their language of choice, and that there are no language barriers that limit their access to key information. We've actually translated a large number of fact sheets and other materials in 13 different languages: Arabic, Chinese, simplified, traditional, French, Hindi, Spanish, Somalian, Korean, Punjabi, Persian, Tagalog, Urdu, and Vietnamese. And we just recently actually added Persian to our list of languages. We've also hosted several town halls in languages such as Chinese, Filipino, Punjabi, and
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge East.
Thank you. Given that as part of the government's pandemic response, they have launched COVID care teams in Edmonton and Calgary that are providing on-the-ground support for communities experiencing a high number of COVID-19 cases, and given that these teams distribute care packages with masks, sanitizers, and resources with information to help people connect with HS if they cannot safely isolate at home. To the Minister of Municipal Affairs, does the government have any plans to extend this program into other cities or communities if needed?
The Honourable the Minister of Finance and President Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, in December we launched the COVID care teams in at-risk communities to support vulnerable Albertans and reduce the spread of COVID-19. Residents in those communities face unique barriers to information and supports. On behalf of the province, thank you to all community tables and COVID care team members for distributing tens of thousands of COVID care kits. In that way, you've demonstrated Alberta's hardworking and neighbourly spirit.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that my office has received multiple calls from constituents saying some people in workplaces are not isolating or are returning to work with symptoms, and given that many Albertans cannot afford to take time off work to isolate, and also given that our government provides a hotel room for those who need to isolate away from their household, as well as $625 after their stay, to the Minister of Municipal Affairs, how can Albertans access this support, and will they have to pay to use this program?
The Honourable the Minister of Finance.
Every Albertan should be able to isolate safely. That's why we've made it possible for every Albertan who cannot isolate safely in their own home, whether it's someone with COVID or their partner, to stay free of charge at a government Alberta-supplied hotel room for up to 14 days. All that's required is a referral by Alberta Health Services.
The Member for Cypress, Medicine Hat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government ran with a commitment to balance the budget by 2022-23. Of all the promises made, this was one of the most important, because if we cannot get our fiscal house in order and control spending, our future will be in servitude to those whom we borrowed from, and interest expense will crowd out every single important priority we have. To the Minister of Finance, could you please inform this House if we are still on the path to balance, and if so, when?
The Honourable the Minister of Finance and President of Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to the member for this important question. I know fiscal responsibility is critically important to the member opposite, and I appreciate him highlighting this issue. Mr. Speaker, it's very important for Albertans that we get to a balanced budget. It's also very important to this government that we get to a balanced budget. That's why Budget 2019 was a 4-year fiscal plan that brought this government to balance in our first term, a commitment we made to Albertans. Mr. Speaker, COVID-19 and the resulting economic challenge has resulted in a necessary delay to balance.
The Honourable Member for Cypress Medicine Hat.
Given that revenue may not be what it was hoped to be with COVID-19 and now the cancellation of Keystone XL, and given that we are seeing Alberta's economic opportunity being driven away at almost every turn, and given that the federal government under Prime Minister Trudeau is perfectly happy to tax our commodity industries ever more while Alberta families continue to struggle, can the Minister please tell the House what viable options we have for returning to balance and negating interest cost?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, Budget 2021 is a 3-year fiscal plan, Mr. Speaker, where we've identified fiscal anchors that will inform our financial decisions until we can provide a path and timeline to balance. Mr. Speaker, we will ensure that Alberta's net debt to GDP remains under 30%, ensuring a relatively strong balance sheet, which will be critical to returning to fiscal stability. And Mr. Speaker, we've also committed to align our spending with that of other provinces on a per capita basis.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you. Given that our debt is currently costing Albertan families over $2 billion annually in interest, this paid to bankers and bondholders, and that we could vastly improve the quality of their lives for all Albertans in so many ways, either with enhanced services or lower taxes, instead of paying this interest, and the more years we lose this interest, the less opportunity we all have. Can the Minister please inform this House of what measures may be taken to ease this deficit in the coming years so that our interest payments do not continue to escalate?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have made a commitment in Budget 2021 to bring down our costs of delivering government services on a per capita basis so that we're delivering government services at least as efficiently as comparator provinces, Mr. Speaker. Budget 2021 over the fiscal plan will accomplish that. On top of that, Mr. Speaker, We are positioning this province for disproportionate economic recovery and growth, which is critical to our long-term fiscal sustainability.
Honourable members, this concludes the time allotted for oral question period. In 30 seconds or less, we will return to member statements.
I see the honourable member for Calgary Cross has a member statement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The COVID-19 pandemic will, without a doubt, go down as a historic time because of all the tragedies, hardships, and losses experienced throughout the world. Here at home, these losses have not only impacted millions of individuals, but the countless small and family-run businesses as well. It is the challenges of small business owners that I rise today to recognize. My statement today recognizes the families that have experienced economic uncertainty throughout this pandemic. I rise to recognize those families who struggle each and every day to pay their rent, their employees, and even their inventory, so they keep going. I rise to recognize those business owners who have worked long hours, often with little reward during this pandemic. Those who have had to make sacrifices and reduce their margins just to keep their businesses alive. And Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize the sacrifices of those family-run businesses who have in fact succumbed to the pressures of this pandemic, and I am extremely disheartened to hear about these stories. The work ethic of all Albertans during this pandemic has been the true pinnacle of what makes this province truly great, and I am confident that we will all overcome this pandemic stronger and better than ever before. Mr. Speaker, small businesses are the economic backbone of this province, and they've proved it throughout this pandemic. Every business I know has been quick to adapt, not only to meet the guidelines that are set forth by this government, but also to ensure the safety of their employees and their customers. What we have seen from the very beginning was countless examples of businesses stepping up to donate where they could, to contribute to this province in some way. And that generosity has eased the burdens on families in this province. I know that this pandemic has been difficult for many, but I am grateful for the work ethic and community devotion that small business owners have demonstrated in this pandemic. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cypress, Medicine Hat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the past couple of years, Halo has put out the warning signal that they are facing financial challenges in providing a crucial service that Southern Albertans have come to rely on. Like STARS Air Ambulance and Hero to the north of us, Halo provides helicopter rescue services for those that find themselves in need of an emergency medical services and transport in remote areas. Just like the others, Halo comes to the rescue for highway collisions and even farming accidents. They have saved so many lives, having completed over 750 missions, and thus have had an immeasurable positive impact on our communities and on our province. Unfortunately, Halo was only given a service fee rather than actual funding arrangements. However, Halo is no less important to Southern Albertans than Hero is to Northern Alberta, or STARS is to the rest of Alberta. Hero receives its agreements because it acknowledges that STARS cannot service that area without stopping to refuel, causing potential life-threatening delays in getting patients to hospitals. The same situation is true when it comes to STARS servicing Southern Alberta. However, the funding is inconsistent and does not match this reality. Albertans to the south feel like they are getting second-class treatment from the government when it comes to funding a vital medical service. Mr. Speaker, this is not acceptable. I acknowledge that the government underwent the Helicopter Emergency Medical Service, or HEMS review, recently, and this report is now complete. Like many other Southerners here in Alberta, I eagerly await the decision from the Minister to see what funding will be recommended and what ultimately will be done. Will Halo and the residents of Southern Alberta be treated equitably when it comes to life-saving services, or will we continue to need to fight to fundraise on our own to keep a service as clearly deemed necessary for other areas, but not Southern Alberta?
Presenting reports by standing and special committees.
The honourable member Calgary West.
Speaker, in accordance with Standing Order 99, the Standing Committee on Private Bills, Private Members, Public Bills has reviewed the petition for the United Church of Canada Amendment Act 2021, which was presented on March 23, 2021. I can advise the Assembly that the petition complies with Standing Orders 90 to 94. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Petitions, notices of motions, introduction of bills, tabling returns and reports.
Are there tablings? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Riverview.
Yes, I have the requisite copy of a research article by Dr. Robert Tanguay and others, the impact of supervised consumption services on fentanyl-related deaths.
Other tablings. The Opposition House Leader has a tabling.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Today I have two tablings. The first is from Alberta Co-op's taxi line, to whom it may concern regarding the critical worker benefit compensation and that their employees did not qualify. The second is specifically from the General Manager of BPS Protective Services. It's a compelling letter expressing his disappointment that his security workers were excluded despite their frontline nature of their work from the critical worker benefit program. Thank you.
Are there other tablings? I do have a tabling today. Today, I will be tabling the appropriate number of copies of the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate of Alberta's mandatory reviews into child death reports.
Advise the Assembly that the following document was deposited with the Office of the Clerk on behalf of Honourable Mr. Kenny, Premier and President of Executive Council and Minister of Intergovernmental Relations. Supplemental response to a question raised by Ms. Notley, Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition, March 10th, 2021, Ministry of Executive Council 2021-22, Main Estimates Debate. Deferred divisions.
Honourable Members, points of order. And at 2:20, the Opposition House Leader raised a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you have provided very, very strong caution in this House on a number of occasions, discouraging the use of the term lying. And you have in the past suggested that if its use continued in this House, that you would be forced to take further action. I heard the term lying no less than 4 times today in this session. Now, in the context of the point of order at 2:20, the Minister of Health, in responding to a genuine question on the part of the member from Edmonton City Centre, referred to the member's false narrative, clearly accusing an individual of lying and using that indirect language to do that. The government has plenty of ways to try and argue the facts and to talk about the opposition or the NDP and their behavior, but referring to an individual member is inappropriate in this place, and I raise this as a point of order for your ruling, Mr. Speaker.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The NDP are lying, Mr. Speaker, and I will point out to you that the opposition leader and her members, almost every question say the government is lying. So it does seem in the official opposition House Leader's comments that it seems to be a double standard on which side can refer to a party lying, Mr. Speaker. At this point, the official opposition points out that when they think the government's lying, the government points out that the NDP is lying inside this chamber, Mr. Speaker. That said, I do agree with the official opposition House Leader that it is unparliamentary to refer to an individual member of this place as lying, or to point out to the chamber when they are lying, or to point out to the chamber when they are doing false narratives inside the spot, Mr. Speaker, would certainly be unparliamentary. And from what I heard from the Minister of Health, he was pointing out that a member was lying and that it was doing a false narrative, and as such, I'd be happy to withdraw and apologize for him.
Well, thank you. I consider the second half of the point of order dealt with and concluded. I would, though, and ask the table to provide some information to the Speaker with respect to the NDP is lying or the government is lying. And I would concur with both of the House leaders in their accurate assessment that the opposition from time to time this week has said the government is lying. And imagine that. The government responded in kind by saying the same thing about the opposition. It's almost like politics has broken out in the chamber. But on November 24th, 2020, your Speaker provided significant caution about this particular issue. It can be found on page 3,386. Again on November 26th, page 3534 for those following along at home. Hi, Mom. And December 2nd of 2020, page 3710, when the opposition House Leader quite rightly noted that I said the following: if this type of language persists from both sides of the House, the Speaker may take additional steps to ban the use of such words. On the day of November 24th, I said at some length, I spoke about this. I said, and this is the important point for all members here today, and I was quoting then Speaker Kowalski, what that members should be speaking on policy and with the highest level of civility and the highest decorum, and not bring personalities and person attacks into or directed towards other members. The use of the word lie may do that, lower the level of decorum. And then I pointed out two separate occasions where I also spoke on this very point, where I said I'd like to point out two separate rulings from your Speaker, first made on June 18th, 2019. Here's what I would say. Let's endeavor to raise the level of decorum and not imply that the government is lying, that individuals are lying, and do our very best to not try to do indirectly what we can't do directly. I went on to say, my sense is that will help raise the level of decorum in this Assembly. I then continued to say, on July 9th, 2020, it seems like every 6 months or so, this Assembly needs to be reminded. On June 18th, just a little more than a year ago, then, I said, here's what I will say. Let's endeavor to raise the level. I think you get the point. Honorable members, if any member of the Assembly accuses the government, a political party, the opposition, or otherwise, it will be deemed as out of order going forward, and we will move on to additional questions should members persist in such language that does not raise the level of decorum. I consider this matter dealt with and concluded. We are at orders of the day. Orders du jour.
Under Government Bills and Orders for third reading, Bill 60, Appropriation Act 2021. Honourable Mr. Taves.
The Honourable Minister of Finance and President of Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to move third reading of Bill 60, the Appropriation Act 2021. On February 25th, I tabled a budget that responds to the immense challenges facing Alberta while maintaining our commitment to the responsible use of taxpayer dollars. Mr. Speaker, ensuring health is adequately resourced to respond to the pandemic and its related effects will continue to be priority number one. Budget 2021 provides health with funding totaling $23 billion. Beyond a $900 million increase to health's budget, the government has also budgeted an additional $1.25 billion contingency specifically for pandemic-related expenses. In addition to protecting health, the budget positions the province for economic recovery and growth. Budget 2021 provides $1.5 billion over 3 years for strategic investments in key sectors. Alberta's government is building on the province's existing strengths in energy, agriculture, and forestry, while encouraging diversification in emerging sectors like technology and innovation, pharmaceuticals, and life sciences. We're also increasing capital plan investments by $1.7 billion in 2021-22, and there's a $500 million contingency for emerging economic recovery initiatives. The government's 3-year capital plan totaling $20.7 billion will result in 50,000 direct and 40,000 indirect jobs over the course of the fiscal plan. In addition, Mr. Speaker, the Innovation Employment Grant is supporting small and medium-sized businesses that invest in research and development. And we're developing a framework to protect intellectual property so ideas created in Alberta can be commercialized in Alberta, contributing to additional economic and job opportunities in the province. Overall, our investment and growth strategy will support emerging sectors while building on our existing strengths. As part of this strategy, the Invest Alberta Corporation will be the business development arm for the Government of Alberta and leverage the immense reach already existing among Alberta businesses and financial institutions. Through Invest Alberta, Alberta's government will provide support and services to drive up investment in Alberta and demonstrate exactly why Alberta is one of the best places in the world to do business. Mr. Speaker, the safety and well-being of children, youth, and families also remains a top priority. Budget 2021 increases funding for the Alberta Child and Family Benefit, a cash payment that helps low-income parents. The budget also provides $16 million to the Rental Assistance Program in 21-22, which will help more Albertans in need of affordable housing. Mr. Speaker, the budget also protects seniors by ensuring they continue to receive the financial support they need. For example, low-income seniors who are most in need will continue to receive among the highest levels of financial assistance in the nation. Mr. Speaker, it's also important to note that we're achieving all of this without abandoning fiscal responsibility and accountability to taxpayers. While the government is protecting and necessarily increasing spending to deal with the pandemic, we are still bringing down overall per capita program expense over the course of the fiscal plan. The prudent management of tax dollars will position Alberta for economic and fiscal recovery. The government will keep Alberta's net debt to GDP ratio below 30%, bring its spending in line with other provinces, and re-establish a plan to balance the budget once the pandemic subsides. Mr. Speaker, through this difficult time, we will remain committed to protecting the health and jobs of all Albertans, and we will do that in a way that's fiscally responsible and transparent. I ask that all members of this House support this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Minister. Are there any honourable members looking to join debate? I see the honourable member for Calgary-McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak to Bill. Mr. Speaker, 2020 has been a difficult year because of the global pandemic. 2021 also poses the same challenges. And this pandemic has impacted Albertans' lives, Albertans' livelihood, and in fact, Albertans are hurting in many different ways. And in this context, Albertans were hoping for a budget that will prioritize their lives, that will prioritize creating jobs. But this UCP budget falls short. This budget doesn't have a plan to create jobs. And as Calgary MLA, our city has seen some really high unemployment rate. Our downtown Calgary has seen 30% vacancy rate. We have seen company after company getting money from this government's handouts and laying off Albertans. And when this government is asked about to do something about Calgary downtown, its vacancy rate and job situation, their answer is that it's not their responsibility. So there is nothing in this budget for Calgary, for Albertans who are looking for jobs. They have money from even previous year in some programs, which they call Job Now program, but which they haven't even rolled out yet. So this budget doesn't reflect the severity of the circumstances and the priorities of Albertans. They are saying they increased health budget. If we take into account population growth and inflation, since April 19, this government has cut $600+ million from healthcare budget. And throughout this pandemic, they have been fighting with doctors in every sense of that word, even on their driveways. They have been threatening public service, nurses, healthcare workers, to fire them. In fact, 11,000 of them are waiting for pink slip from this government. At a time when governments around the globe are supporting their healthcare heroes, this UCP government is the only government that has been fighting with the doctors. And for months now, we have been asking this government to release the updated modeling, to release how variants will play out in province. And they continue to hide that information. And that's a critical information for Albertans, individuals, businesses to see so they can plan the future based on the risk they are facing. And instead responding to the job crisis in private sector, instead coming up with a plan to address the job crisis, their plan is to lay off more people from public sector. Somehow, that's their job creation plan. Their own budget documents indicate that there will be 7.7% reduction in public service. If we talk about infrastructure spending, and specifically if I talk about Northeast Calgary, this budget doesn't include a single new school for Calgary Public or Calgary Catholic. And in Northeast Calgary, which is a growing area in city of Calgary, we needed school in Skyview. We needed school for people in Cityscape. We needed school for people in Redstone. And this infrastructure budget does nothing to address that need. It's failing Calgarians. It's failing people in Northeast Calgary. And while I'm talking about Northeast Calgary, I should also mention that this government abandoned Northeast Calgary when they were hit by the 4th largest natural disaster in Canadian history. Residents in Northeast Calgary were told that hailstorm is covered by insurance. That's why they are not eligible to get support from disaster recovery program. And Mr. Speaker, that was not correct. 2 months before that hailstorm, Fort McMurray flooded, and the government provided $147 million from disaster recovery program to help residents and businesses in Fort McMurray. And let me say this, there was the right thing to do for the government. There was an unprecedented situation. But there are 13 companies in Alberta who provide insurance for floods, just for members' information. And that's the information Insurance Bureau of Canada is providing, and I personally checked it, verified it. So we were treated differently than Fort McMurray in Northeast Calgary, and that's unfair, and this budget doesn't do anything to correct that unfairness. When it comes to providing those who are fighting on the front lines, again, this budget falls short. First, the government delayed 287 days to apply for the Critical Worker Benefit Program to get the money that was waiting for them in Ottawa. And when they got that money, they didn't let workers apply directly. Rather, they will rely on their employer to apply on their behalf. And that added more costs to the program. And secondly, they excluded many from accessing that benefit. That includes cab drivers, many of whom live in my riding, many of whom live in the ridings of other members, including Calgary Falcon Ridge, Calgary Northeast. They excluded long-haul truck drivers. They excluded many who were in Skip the Dishes and other working with the delivery companies. So this budget doesn't address the needs of those who are on the front lines of this pandemic. And instead, what they got from this government, that they got blamed by the Premier, that they are the one spreading the virus. And by the way, they are still waiting for this Premier to apologize for that. If I talk about my portfolio, critic role, they are cutting $65 million from justice budget this year alone. At a time when we needed to address issues of systemic racism, at a time we are seeing the rise of Islamophobia, at a time when we are seeing a Muslim woman's hijab torn off in the city of Calgary, they are cutting from the justice budget and the services those communities need. They are cutting from policing budget. They are cutting from Court of Queen's Bench budget, provincial court budget. They are cutting from resolution services. They are cutting everywhere from the justice budget. And that will impact the services that Justice Department provides, critical services. And while we are seeing the rise of racism and citizens getting victimized on the streets in broad daylight, there is no support, no specific program to address the rise of racism in our province. We know education is one of the best tools to address racism, but it's the second year in a row that they have allocated $0 for multiculturalism grants that also address racism. $0, Mr. Speaker. And with respect to economy, they have no plan. Their only plan was to give $4.7 billion to corporations. and wait and see when jobs will be created. And before the pandemic, I'm not talking about the pandemic. Before the pandemic, this government lost 50,000 jobs in Alberta. Not only they're not spending money on creating jobs, not only this budget doesn't have a job plan, they're not doing anything for diversification. Last year when Finance Minister was asked about diversification, that was Minister's word, that diversification is a long-term luxury. One of the critical sector that is helping economies diversify around the globe, across Canada, is post-secondary institution. And that budget has been on the chopping block from day one. They're jacking up tuition fees. They're jacking up student loan interest fees. University of Calgary, University of Alberta, SAIT, everyone is forced to lay off their staffs. And this goes to show how serious they are about diversifying our economy. Mr. Speaker, Albertans deserve a budget that is focused on making sure that their health and lives are protected. That is focused on making sure that there is a solid job plan. That is focused on making sure that Calgary downtown vacancy rates are addressed. That is focused on funding our education and post-secondary education. That is focused on building the infrastructure such as schools in our communities. And this budget clearly falls short. I urge all members of this House to vote against this budget. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any other members looking to join debate on this matter? I see the Honourable Member for Calgary Klein has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and for this opportunity to be able to speak on this budget. This last year has been challenging for so many. It's been heart-wrenching for others. Many have lost their jobs, freedoms, their businesses, lives, and loved ones. We need hope. We need hope that tomorrow will be brighter so that we can have the strength to get there. And that is what I was looking for in this budget. Thankfully, I was not disappointed. Budget 2021 outlines 3 priorities: protecting lives, protecting livelihoods, and fiscal accountability. We can't put the first 2 bullets in front of the third and risk those first 2 bullets for future generations, which means we are in a quandary because we also can't cut our way out of a recession and a global pandemic. We instead must ensure that our programs are prudently funded, giving the services Albertans need at the cost that will not put those same services out of reach for our children and our grandchildren. Budget 2021 invests in health care while positioning the province for economic recovery with a continued focus on efficient delivery of government services. The members opposite constantly cry that we are cutting funds, that we are starving our health care system when the truth could not be further from their statements. Budget 2021 provides record investment in health care to fight COVID-19, including $1.25 billion in new spending specifically for COVID-19, increased spending to help address surgical backlog caused by the pandemic, $143 million for new health care facilities, the government's $152 million investment to increase access to mental health and addiction services continues. In dealing with COVID-19 today, we must not also forget to prepare for tomorrow. and I'm glad to see that the budget does exactly that. Budget 2021 paves the way for growth for Alberta's post-pandemic economy. $21 billion in capital projects to create jobs. $1.5 billion to support core sectors like agriculture, technology, energy, tourism. $500 million contingency to further economic recovery initiatives. In addition, this budget puts a focus on diversification and innovation. Our tourism strategy, it removes barriers for entrepreneurs and small businesses. It implements the province's investment and growth strategy, engaging new companies to grow in this province. It expands venture capital investment into Alberta companies. This budget has a large focus on technology and innovation as well. $166 million for innovation and employment grants. The good news is our efforts to reduce burden on business have also been working. I've heard in this House from many of the members opposite that we are not attracting investment. The jobs are drying up, but the facts speak for themselves, Mr. Speaker. We see record investment. Head offices moving to Alberta. Just a short list of these include mCloud Technologies, Petro-Canada, and most recently, Infosys. Examples of increased investment in the tech sector also are there. Benevity, Ever, Vision State, and Jobber are great examples of growth in this new sector. Let me return again to the theme of maintaining responsible spending. The pandemic, global recession, and plummet in oil prices put our plan to balance off track for 2023. But sticking to strong fiscal anchors is going to be critical, and that's what we see here in budget. Keeping debt to GDP below 30%, bringing our spending, continuing our plan to bring our spending in line with other provinces, so that after the pandemic, we can reestablish a timeline and a path back to balance. We must spend where we need to in order to provide the services Albertans need today. But we must also make sure that we do not spend beyond our needs. I'm pleased to say that our government also continues to invest in compassion. We're investing more money, $3.5 billion for continuum care, and $736 million for home care, and $1.6 million for billion for designated supportive living settings, and $1.2 billion for long-term care settings. Already mentioned in this, but I think it's worth repeating. Budget 2021 continues our investment of $152 million to increase access for mental health and addiction services, and the more than 4,000 new publicly funded treatment spaces for Albertans, and create a recovery-orientated system of care. We eliminated user fees for Albertans accessing publicly funded addiction beds. Prior to this change, there were many Albertans who couldn't afford to get the treatment that they needed. Seniors, students, and many others were faced with the inevitable choice of treatment or spiraling debt. No Albertans should have to sell their car or get bogged down in debt to recover and have a better life. And I'm very happy that this government has made the change and continues to make changes to help Albertans get the treatment that they need. Recovery is for everyone. I wanted to talk a little bit about education as well. Being a father of 4, I know it's very important. Alberta's students continue to benefit from the best funded education system in Canada. Alberta's government is maintaining education spending to school authorities despite the decrease in enrollment. In Budget 2021, more than $130 million in mitigation funding will be received by the school boards. In 2021, the budget includes over $1 billion in capital investment for education to continue its commitment to fund schools and infrastructure, despite what we've been hearing all day. Alberta Education will continue to examine the funding under learning support funding grants in order to ensure that our most vulnerable students and children are supported. That is why we are providing an additional $40 million to learning support funding. At the end of 2019-2020 school year, school boards reported a total of $384 million in operating reserves. This is an increase in $21 million during these unprecedented times. As part of the Budget 2020, our government announced a new funding model for K-12 education. This new model reduces red tape and administration costs by reducing the number of funding envelope, while maintaining the overall funding level and giving school authorities more autonomy and flexibility to invest in the classroom based on their student needs. I wanted to talk a little bit about the learning support funding. We know that the pandemic has negatively affected learning for some students, particularly those in vulnerable groups. That is why we are providing an additional $40 million to learning support funding. Learning support funding grants support specialized learning needs or groups or students who may require additional supports for school authorities. This includes funding for the Specialized Learning Support Grant and Program Unit funding. It's worth talking a little bit about post-secondary education as well. And members opposite rightly note that well-funded post-secondary education is critical for preparing our children and young adults for the jobs of tomorrow. Alberta is funding post-secondary education in a responsible way that represents taxpayer dollars, provides students with greater value for their investment, and ensures that we continue to produce a skilled workforce for today and for tomorrow. We're moving forward on a number of key priorities that will enhance post-secondary education. The Alberta 2030 Building Skills for Jobs initiative will build on a common vision and direction for our higher education system. Budget 2021 includes $5.8 billion for advanced education, and it supports over 269,000 full and part-time students. We have the highest per-student spending when compared to BC, Ontario, and Quebec. Differences as big as $10,000 per student. Funding for seniors. A provincial investment of more than $170 million will help keep residents and staff in long-term care, designated supportive living facilities, and senior lodges safe from COVID-19. We know seniors are most at risk from COVID-19. Operations are facing rising costs to maintain their facilities, and we want to make sure that they can comply with provincial health orders and keep Albertans safe. Anyway, Budget 2021-2022 provides hope. It invests in economic recovery. It invests in making sure that we can protect the lives and livelihoods of Albertans so that we can get through this pandemic and we can work towards a better future for Albertans. It provides hope. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member. 29-2A is available. I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to respond to some of the comments from the member for Calgary-Klein. Now, the member spoke of the investment that is coming into the province of Alberta, and in particular about the tech sector. Now, he was able to name 3 companies that were coming to Alberta, at least one of which I know was under serious discussions long before this government came into power with the member to my right, the member for Edmonton Beverly Clearview, when he was the Minister of Economic Development and Trade. So the fact is, indeed, we did a lot of work, we built momentum, and thankfully some of that carried over even when this government came in and gutted supports for the technology sector. The member referred to a company, Jobber, and praised their growth, and indeed I'm very proud to have Jobber here as part of my constituency for Edmonton City Centre. But Mr. Speaker, I don't claim anything for their growth because that company was founded in 2011, Mr. Speaker. One of the unicorns, as it were, that without the support of conservative governments for so many years, still managed to build a successful technology company here. Any success goes to those good folks at Jobber, Mr. Speaker, and has nothing to do with this government. And indeed, a government that, according to the report of their own Innovation Capital Working Group, raised and salted the earth in terms of technology company development in the province of Alberta. Now, they have restored a small piece of that with their Innovation Employment Working Grant, or whatever they call that, which is basically just a reiteration of the shred that they also canceled, which every other province had. So I think the government needs to think twice before it claims that it has done anything in that area of diversification so far. I would also note the member talked about post-secondary education, and indeed that is a key part if we truly want to grow that and diversify the technology sector. As the member himself said, it's essential we prepare for the jobs of the future. This government is not doing that, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, they have introduced severe cuts to post-secondary education. They canceled the programs that we had put in place to create more seats for technology programs in the province of Alberta. So this government is not investing to grow that sector. It is not investing in post-secondary education. And he talks about their plans for 2030. Mr. Speaker, students' tuition is going through the roof now. We're at risk of losing programs at our universities now. Whatever grand plans the Minister of Advanced Education may have for 2030, the damage is being done to Alberta right now in the midst of an economic crisis. So whatever this member seems to believe his government is doing, we are not seeing success. We have lost jobs since his government came into power, long before COVID ever entered the scene. This government is doing more damage. It is digging Alberta into a deeper hole. And is failing to make the investments that we need to make. There are many other recommendations within that Innovation Capital Working Group report, some very good things. And indeed, we've been hearing similar things as my colleague, the member for Edmonton Beverly Clearview, has been consulting with the technology sector. There is nothing in this budget that advances that work. Indeed, it undercuts Alberta Innovates, which, by the way, interestingly enough, was involved in the trial for the service that was being put forward through AHS. It was canceled by the Minister for Mental Health and Addictions. Alberta Innovates had a piece of that. That was going to be done as an actual official study, academic. That's been replaced by this government with a corporate pilot campaign program. So again, what we see, Mr. Speaker, throughout this budget is incredibly short-sighted cuts based on ideology, based on a lack of understanding of what's actually needed here in the province of Alberta, as this Premier tries to backfill on promises after promises that he has broken and failed to deliver on for the people of Alberta. And when I hear members of the government stand up to praise this budget, those words ring hollow, and I think they ring hollow in the words of many, many Albertans, as the polling shows.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any members wishing to join debate? I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Beverly Clearview has risen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I will give a quick shout out to my colleague, the member from Edmonton City Centre, for his words and points when it comes to the track record of this government and the success that some companies in the province are having. I do want to speak to this budget and will frame the budget, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, as disappointing. Disappointing on a number of fronts. I will comment, primarily around the fact or how the budget will and has failed to help stimulate job creation, despite the fact that the government claims that it will. We can look back now, almost 2 years to an announcement this government had to accelerate the corporate tax reduction in a classic race to the bottom, which should be noted, Mr. Speaker, that Alberta already had the lowest corporate taxes, the lowest overall taxes in Canada by a mile. In fact, I remember reading report after report that even with the carbon tax, Alberta was still the lowest tax jurisdiction, about $7 billion less Albertans paid in taxes than Saskatchewan, which was the second lowest tax jurisdiction. So regardless, we knew that Alberta already had an incredibly competitive tax regime. What we do know, Mr. Speaker, and why this budget is disappointing and frustrating is that we see report after report, whether it's from McKinsey or other organizations, we hear from company after company that talk about the number one criteria for companies to move to a new jurisdiction or to set up shop or to grow a local ecosystem is talent. Talent that's the global race. is for talent. And we know that talent is much more mobile than it used to be. We also know that, that more and more people are working from home due to COVID-19. But the fact of the matter, Mr. Speaker, is that if Alberta wants to compete on the global stage and continue to have success stories like Infosys and other companies, Jobber, as my colleague mentioned, we need to be investing in talent. And it's quite frustrating, Mr. Speaker, when you look at this budget. You know, I mean, the fact of the matter is, where we are today with our post-secondary investments, the last 2 years have amounted in almost $700 million in cuts to our post-secondary compared to the NDP's 2018 budget. That is significant, Mr. Speaker. Those cuts to the very institutions that attract global top talent, they attract the researchers, they attract students. We know, Mr. Speaker, there's report after report of students who study at post-secondary institutions are likely to stay once they graduate because they've already invested 4 years of their time and put down roots. So the fact that we are making our post-secondaries less competitive, we're going to lose these incredible researchers because they look at where they can go. You know, an example that I gave when I spoke about this budget bill, Mr. Speaker, earlier, is the fact of if we look at why the University of Alberta is home to the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute, or AMI, which of course is ranked third in the world. It's ranked third in the world because of the researchers that are there. And first and foremost, Dr. Rich Sutton is world-renowned. When he came to the U of A, he had a massive following. Some of the top students want to study under him and followed him to AMI, to Edmonton. Why? Because governments had the foresight, starting back in the early 2000s, to invest in AMI. Not looking for a quick win, knowing that these kind of investments take time. Now, every member in this chamber will know that I will always give credit where credit is due. And absolutely, it was Conservative governments that started it. Under the NDP, we continued it. We actually increased the funding to AMI to $4.5 million a year. From the early 2000s until 2015, it was $2 million a year that was budgeted for AMI. We increased that amount. We saw the opportunity that exists. And quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, one of the most proud moments that I had in our 4 years in government was when I stood with the former Premier to announce $100 million over 5 years for technology and artificial intelligence, bringing an AMI campus to Calgary, expanding our technology accelerators, attracting a globally recognized technology accelerator like a Y Combinator or Techstars, that of course bring with it a vast network of investors, of wealth, of expertise that are all globally connected. That $100 million would have also contributed to a number of programs that would continue to support the Alberta ecosystem and to support our companies. Needless to say, Mr. Speaker, you won't find that $100 million in this budget. You didn't find it in last year's budget or the previous budgets tabled by this UCP government. In fact, one of the first things they did was to cancel that $100 million investment, along with a cancellation of a number of programs, including tax credit programs that were working. A 3-to-1 return on investment by anyone in the market would deem that as a good ROI. That's what we were getting for the investor tax credit. Mr. Speaker, for the capital investment tax credit, $200 million leveraged $2.2 billion of capital investment, private sector capital investment into the province, creating thousands of jobs. both in construction and then in permanent long-term. Now, in this budget, we do agree with the government that their capital investments are a positive thing. We did the exact same thing. In fact, we took advice from the former Bank of Canada Governor, David Dodge, who said in an economic downturn, that's when governments should be investing in infrastructure. It creates jobs. You're going to also get cost savings because of reduced costs on labor and materials. So the government's doing that. Great. That is good. I would argue there's nothing creative about doing that. Now, what's interesting, though, is in this budget, the minister has baked in the $1.2 billion Keystone XL bungle into the budget as part of the capital investment. How many jobs is that creating? It's frustrating that this government has, since it's come into office, continued to gamble, not only on the Keystone XL pipeline, but also on claiming that the corporate tax rate reduction would be the silver bullet to jobs and wealth. And you know what's interesting, Mr. Speaker? All of the tech companies that the government stands up and applauds, none of them are successful because of the corporate tax rate reduction. None have come to Alberta because of our corporate tax rate. You don't believe me? Go ask them. They'll tell you why they came to Alberta. And quite frankly, this current budget with massive cuts to post-secondary, with a little bit of money that's been given back to the institutions like Alberta Innovates, $89 million was cut last year. You give them back $30 million. Okay, well, you're still short $59 million. So do you want them applauding this budget? No, they say, well, I guess that's good. I mean, you didn't cut us again. You gave back some money. But investing is restoring what you cut and then adding to that. And we know that there is incredible opportunity in this province. But this current budget is not leveraging Alberta's strengths. It's not taking advantage of the incredible ingenuity, innovation, creativity that we know Albertans have. The government's talked about sector strategies. And I agree with sector strategies. In fact, I agree so much because under our government, we started developing sector strategies. I mean, and by all means, pull off the top page that says NDP government and throw on your own cover page. That's fine. I hope that the government is looking at a lot of the work the departments did. And I won't take credit for that. That's the departments that came up with a whole suite of programs in everything from agriculture and forestry to tourism to obviously technology. So sector strategies, I think, can be good, and I'm hopeful. But what's frustrating is that sector strategies are the diversification silver bullet the government talks about, and when we say, show us the line item in the budget on where the investment is, well, we don't know yet. We don't have it. We're still working on it. What we do know is there's a $500 million contingency fund, which in estimates I call the slush fund, which essentially it is, but except it's not $500 million. It's $380. There's $120 that's already been earmarked. But the challenge with this $380 million that's remaining, if all of that was going towards sector strategies, okay, that's a decent amount of money. Now let's talk about which programs. What are the qualifications? How do you get it into the hands of companies? The problem is the contingency is also the contingency fund for COVID's third wave. So should we start to fall behind in the race to vaccinate Albertans and more money is needed to fight COVID, where does that money come from? It comes from the contingency fund that would have been funding sector strategies. See, the problem is this pot of money is going to be allocated or used by a number of different causes. And so to say, oh yeah, it's for sector strategies, well, depends where that ranks on the list of priorities. Now, we tried to get that information from the government. Of course, they wouldn't give it to us. I honestly think to an extent the government doesn't even know. Again, I mean, we can't predict COVID. I recognize it's the federal government that's responsible for procuring vaccinations and getting them to the province. I get that. However, if we want to be serious about supporting diversification, which is building on our strengths in agriculture. I know my colleague, the member for Edmonton Manning, has been talking about how to enhance our food processing abilities here in the province. How do we attract more investment? How do we grow this sector? I mean, Alberta has incredible opportunities. I mean, something that I've always found fascinating is, yet disappointing, is why we aren't bigger champions of Alberta barley. I don't know if members know this, but I had an opportunity to, when I was on a trade mission in Japan, to visit the Sapporo brewery. They use Alberta barley, and they are the first ones to say this is the best in the world. And so many different countries and companies use our raw products. Why aren't we doing more with them? Why aren't we adding value, keeping those high-paying jobs here in the province and exporting products for a much higher value? You know, I think maybe I would characterize this budget as a budget of missed opportunities, really. Again, you know, when we talk about you know, post-secondaries, I can't help, I mean, it's extremely frustrating that in the cuts across the board to post-secondaries, one university bore 50% of those cuts. One university, the U of A. Right after they are awarded a Nobel Prize, the government says, great job, you know what, you did so well, we're going to cut your budget in half. And now try to replicate that. See how many world-class scientists will want to come to a university with a budget cut in half. Like, to me, I look at the actions of this government, and they seem pretty anti-Metro Edmonton to me. You look at investments that are being made, you look at the focus and the priority, and of course...
Thank you, Honourable Member. 29-2A is available for questions and comments. Seeing none. Are there any members wishing to join debate? I see the Honourable Member for Drayton Valley Devon has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased today to be able to rise and speak in favor of Bill 60, the Appropriation Act 2021. As we all know, this past year, it's not been an easy one for Albertans. And we continue to see the effects that have been brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. We've seen significant drop in the oil prices over this past year, and we've had an economic recession. And many people are frustrated, and rightfully so, as there are still many uncertainties that are regarding the pandemic and when things are going to be able to get back to normal. Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to doing everything that we can for Albertans during this time, and the 2021 budget plays a big part in that. Now, Budget 2021 is aimed at protecting the lives and the livelihoods of all Albertans as we continue to go through these extremely difficult times. In fact, it provides an historic investment in order to ensure that our healthcare system is able to continue the strong fight. Mr. Speaker, the health budget for 2021 is set for $23 billion, which is an increase of over $900 million. And this government has committed $1.25 billion in additional funding as we continue to battle the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Speaker, on top of helping out the health industry, Budget 2021 is also going to help to create more jobs by and for Albertans, as there will be a $3.1 billion more spent in 2021-22 to continue supporting strategies in Alberta's recovery plan. And this is a bold strategy designed to help create jobs and build infrastructure and to diversify the Alberta economy. Budget 2021 will provide $1.7 billion more in capital funding in 2021-22. $1.7 billion more in capital than had been planned for Budget 2020. And this government's 3-year capital plan is now $20.7 billion. And it will support more than 50,000 direct and 40,000 indirect jobs through to 2024. Mr. Speaker, Budget 2021's responsible approach to spending will result in more investment in areas of extremely high priority right now, mainly healthcare and job creation. And this government remains committed to responsible spending by identifying goals to get Alberta's finances back on track. Our first goal is to align Alberta's spending with other comparable provinces. And the second is to make sure that the debt that we take on can be paid back by keeping it below 30% of our gross domestic product. By the end of this current 3-year plan, debt will be less than 27% of GDP. Now, throughout this entire pandemic, this government has acted both quickly and effectively to address the many problems that this pandemic has caused. And Albertans should expect nothing different going forward. This government's COVID-19 response will continue to be a significant driver of government spending moving forward, as we anticipate having to support many sectors as a result of the pandemic throughout both this year as well as into 2022. Another industry budget 2021 will provide relief to is education. Despite the many negatives the pandemic has brought on, Alberta's students have continued to benefit from one of the best funded education systems throughout all of Canada. Mr. Speaker, despite a decrease in enrollment, this government is maintaining education spending to school authorities. And there will be more than $130 million received by school boards in mitigation funding as a result of this budget 2021. And on top of that, it also includes over $1 billion in capital investment for education to continue its commitment to fund school infrastructure. Going forward, Alberta Education will continue examining the funding under learning support funding grants in order to ensure that our most vulnerable students and children receive the support that they deserve. Mr. Speaker, this is why we are providing an additional $14 million to the learning support funding. And our students are the future of this great province. And this government, along with Budget 2021, is committed to doing everything in its power to ensure that they receive the best education possible. And my hope is that Budget 2021 is able to provide relief to Albertans who have shown great resiliency through these extremely difficult times. I am extremely proud of Albertans for the strength that they have shown throughout this pandemic, and I am also very proud of the hard work of everybody who played a part in the creation of Budget 2021. And I am positive that this budget will be great in both the short and the long-term success of this incredible province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member. 29-2A is available. Seeing none, are there any honourable members looking to join? I see the honourable member for Edmonton Northwest.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for this opportunity to speak on this budget 2021. And there's been a lot said in regards to this budget in many different subject areas and different ministries, but I would like to focus in on the situation regarding advanced education, because of course I am the critic for the official opposition for advanced education, but I've just been also seeing as an Albertan and as an interested citizen very concerned about not just this budget, but the last 3 successive budgets that have delivered quite significant cuts to advanced education here in the province of Alberta. And I just want to take a couple of steps back, and perhaps each of us can have that their own experience in their own way in their own region across the province. But we have 26 colleges and trade schools, polytechnics and universities across this province, and we're uniquely positioned in this regard compared to other jurisdictions across the country in that we have these colleges and universities and polytechnics dispersed throughout the province in a sort of a unique geographic sort of way. You have facilities such as, for example, in High Prairie, in Lac La Biche, in Medicine Hat, in Vermilion, and other, as I say, 26 colleges across the province. And they offer a very unique opportunity for local young people especially to get an education close to where they grew up. This helps to increase enrollment rates, it helps to increase retention rates, and it makes a post-secondary education more affordable for those students in those regions. Another benefit, Mr. Speaker, is that these colleges, from the very smallest ones to the very largest universities, contribute an important part of the local economy to those towns and cities in which they reside. Now, after 3 successive cutting budgets to our post-secondaries, we have compromised the integrity of this system that's taken more than 100 years to build. More than 100 years of investing in the reputation, in attracting talent, in building the infrastructure for, as I say, quite a unique post-secondary system here in Alberta compared to the rest of the country. It takes 100 years or more to build something like that up, Mr. Speaker, and it just takes a few months or 3 budgets to start it all crashing down. And so I think all Albertans are concerned about this, whether you live in Calgary, whether you live in High Prairie or in Red Deer. I was just in Red Deer College yesterday. And again, after 3 successive cutting budgets, students and faculty, indeed the city of Red Deer, indeed central Alberta is starting to say, hey, what are you doing? Where's the investment that we had been promised and expected to transform Red Deer College into a university? Not only has that process been stalled, but even 5 programs that were already expected to be starting have been sitting somewhere in limbo on somebody's desk. 5 programs, degree programs, that they expected to have at Red Deer College lying in, as I say, in limbo, from budget cuts, from a lack of action, a lack of direction from this UCP government in regards to education. A city like Red Deer, it's more than 100,000 people now. It's not a small town anymore like it was from when Red Deer College started, and it needs a post-secondary that's commensurate with the needs and the population that lives not just in Red Deer but throughout central Alberta. They're fed up, quite frankly. I could feel it. There was a strong sense of not taking Red Deer College seriously, taking it for granted, and I fear that this same sort of situation is being replicated in other places across the province here too. These colleges and universities make an important economic contribution to the places in which they reside as well. It's no coincidence that a place like Lakeland College in Vermilion has made a significant contribution to the stability of that town and that region. During an economic downturn, you still have the college and the jobs that are associated with that and the opportunities and economic opportunities that are associated with that. That's not nothing, Mr. Speaker. That's a significant something that you can look at by degree of exponentially larger contributions to a city like Calgary with Mount Royal College, University of Calgary, SAIT, and other facilities or institutions in that city. I fear from 3 successive cutting budgets, and always you must judge an individual or a government or anybody on what they do, not what they say necessarily. 3 successive cutting budgets tells Albertans, tells me that this government's not taking post-secondary education seriously and doesn't realize that it's not just a liability on the ledger sheet of a budget, it's an investment that will pay exponential returns if you make wise choices in regards to our colleges and universities and polytechnics. The cuts have added up to more than $690 million since the 2018 budget, the last budget that our government put down for a post-secondary education. And I hear not just the minister, but many of the elected officials from the government side saying, well, we spend too much on post-secondary education. We spend more than other provinces, and we need to cut it down to more of the mean or the average. You can do lots of interesting things with figures, Mr. Speaker. It's a magical art sometimes. And, the numbers and the figures that are being most often quoted from the minister in these MLAs, they're more than 2.5 years old or 3 years old. And what happened in those 2.5 and 3 years? We've had 3 years of budget cuts that have put us not at the top of expenditures for post-secondary anymore. Not even close, in the middle somewhere. And from the beginning as well, we have had, as my colleagues have pointed out, successive conservative governments and whoever else, the UFA governments, and right from the beginning of 1905, saying that we want to build a world-class post-secondary system here in the province. That's the key to develop it. It was the very first bill, I believe, that was brought forward in this House back in 1905, the bill that would enact the creation of the University of Alberta, right? People knew that was the key to the future. And here we are, 100 and some years later, and again, we're at that crossroads where we need a way by which we can diversify our economy. And the very best asset, Mr. Speaker, that I would suggest that we have at our disposal is our 26 colleges, polytechnics, universities across this province that can help us to diversify the economy, to build partnerships with business, and to help us to train and retrain our population, and to help us to retain our young population as well. I've heard MLAs across the aisle talking about how we have a young population, and it's all true. But again, these things are only as good as what you invest in next to ensure the prosperity and the security that comes with keeping that young population in the province, working at meaningful jobs and careers, and contributing to our communities and our society. When young people can't find a position in a university or a college, they'll go elsewhere for it, right? You're the very most mobile when you're young, and lots of people go to get an education and a job elsewhere, and they don't come back. I'm concerned about that, Mr. Speaker, because as we said, we do have a large cohort of young people that are coming through grade school right now. Lord knows we needed to build. I think we built more than 200 schools that filled up immediately with that cohort of kids coming through. Well, guess what, Mr. Speaker? They will need university, college, trade, polytechnic positions in the next few years to carry on with their studies and carry on with their lives. If we don't invest and put more money into post-secondary, not cutting $690 million, but turning that right around, if we don't do that, we're not going to be able to serve that cohort of young people that need those positions in just a few years' time. Time's ticking on it. They're in grade school right now, in junior high, hitting high school. We need, I believe, the College of University Presidents did a study a couple of years ago which suggests that we need 10,000 or more positions in our post-secondaries immediately. Start building for them now. You can't build new positions, 10,000 new positions, by cutting $690 million out of the post-secondary budget over the last 3 successive UCP budgets. You just can't do that. I know in the city of Calgary, for example, people value and understand the importance of a strong post-secondary education system. Lots of people love to talk about Infosys. I believe they came from Vancouver? No. Silicon Valley. Okay, there you go.
Indian company.
Oh, okay, thank you very much. They cited very clearly that choosing to move to Calgary for lifestyle and for the interaction that they can have with the post-secondary institutions that reside not just in that city, but right across this province as well. Facing a very important decision, it's very useful and helpful for the city of Calgary, at least in part because of the integrity and the quality of the post-secondary that's available in that city and across the province. So you're only as good as the next thing you do, right? A reputation is something that's very, it's fleeting. And while we might have a Nobel Prize winner at the University of Alberta this last year, you know, you're only as good as the next thing you do. Is someone like Michael Houghton going to, the next Michael Houghton down the way, 10 years from now, going to make a choice to move to a place like the University of Alberta if it continues its downward spiral of cuts, a downward spiral to mediocrity? Probably not. We worked really hard over a long period of time to build that reputation and to attract different research capacity and projects that are very successful. It's things that we should be very proud of in biomedical fields, in nanotechnology, for example, artificial intelligence, virology, as Michael Houghton was working in. But again, you're only as good as the next thing you invest in. And this budget is not a reflection of a commitment to post-secondary that we need at this time. Combined with those cuts to operational expenses to our post-secondaries is a dramatic increase in tuition for students. In other words, making it more expensive to go to school. And removing the cap and allowing a 7% and encouraging a 7% increase in tuition over the next 3 years that's 21%. And, you know, whenever you make an increase like that, you are losing a certain group of students that simply will not choose to go to school because it's too expensive and they can't afford it. And again, I've heard the argument that, well, our tuition was lower and now we're going to move to the national average. Yeah, well, I mean, that's partially true, but it's also partially true that Alberta students carry more debt load than any other students in provinces and territories across the province, across this country as well. And when that debt load reaches a certain threshold, then people will choose not to go. They'll choose not to go to school, and we lose that value in those young people as they move throughout their working careers and so forth. So there's lots of things we could have done with our post-secondary budget over this last year, and as I suggest, over these last 3 years as well. And people are starting to pick up and notice, definitely. It's well known that, you know, the University of Alberta here and the NAIT in this city, Grant MacEwan as well, you know, we're a center of education. We're a center of education excellence. And it's reflected in the quality of education and the reputation of the degrees that come from those institutions. And it's reflected in the economy of the city of Edmonton. You can take that same story and move it down to Lethbridge, right? Lethbridge with its college and the University of Lethbridge makes a very important contribution to that city and helps to provide a very stable economy in that city too. Don't look at post-secondary investment as red ink on your ledger. Look at it as an investment. It's an investment that will pay exponential dividends and create economic diversity and stability in each of the places in which our universities are.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any takers for 29.2A for questions and comments? Seeing none, are there any members looking to join debate? I see the Honourable Member for Highwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's getting late on the Thursday afternoon, but it's a huge privilege to be able to stand here today and give my support for Budget 2021. I think the Minister of Treasury, Board and Finance has framed this extremely well in saying that there's been immense challenges over the last year. These challenges for Albertans have been extensive. We've had mass uncertainty in our lives. We've had mass uncertainty to both our physical and our mental health, and economic uncertainty through our businesses and labor market. And I believe that Albertans are very eager to get their personal lives and our economy back on track as we near the end of these troubling times. And that's why I'm pleased to support this budget. This budget is our commitment to the people that we're sticking to our commitment to protect Alberta lives and livelihoods and focus on our goal of successfully relaunching Alberta's economy. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, global economic recession, and the instability in the oil and gas market, Alberta's key sources of revenue have taken a significant hit. Our infrastructure in my personal opinion, is starting to stabilize, and our government sees within this an exceptional opportunity to invest in Alberta's critical infrastructure, and with that, create new opportunities for the province. And this is an outstanding opportunity for rural communities to receive investment in their local infrastructure to help develop their economies. Additionally, investing in new rural infrastructure creates, like I said, this growth, this opportunity for growth to help the future of Alberta, the future labor market for its citizens, our youth, by supplying small towns with the ability to participate even more in a growing economy as we come out of this. In Budget 2021, Alberta's economic infrastructure will receive more investments as we move forward. And some of these investments I want to talk about. There has been some statements from the members opposite, specifically the member from Calgary, McCall, that this government has no plan to create jobs. And I sit here staring at this, and my background coming from construction, I'm staring at a capital infrastructure investment plan, one of which, that over the 3-year plan, has moved to $20.7 billion and will support 50,000 direct and 40,000 indirect jobs through 2024. Now, this capital plan includes additional funding for 41 projects totaling $825.8 million over 3 years. And being in construction, it's important to understand that this just isn't construction jobs. This is accountants, project managers, consultants, architects. It goes on and on, our suppliers, our trucking, everything. These are great jobs moving forward. Now, within these provincial infrastructure upgrades, we also have within that the $3 billion, of course, over the next 3 years to extend the life of key provincial infrastructure. Now, it's not always glorious when we talk about maintenance of our infrastructure, but it's crucial for our path out of this, our growth out of this. Our recovery relies on the fact that we have the infrastructure in place to be able to support the growth in everything from agri-food production, agriculture, oil and gas, in every single sector. And these investments that we're putting into these areas pre-position Alberta much better to have that growth and create those jobs. Within that, I feel as though I should highlight a few of these key facts. I think that actually really apply to some of the rural areas of all across Alberta, and specifically being from a rural riding, representing a rural riding of Highwood, that we talk about the $343 million for the health facilities to cover costs associated with repairs, upgrades, and maintenance. This is crucial. We have small health facilities across our rural communities that need these upgrades, need these repairs. This is the kind of infrastructure and attention to infrastructure that we need in order to be able to combat some of the rural decline that we continue to see in our province, because we do want to have those great health facilities within our small rural communities. As well with that, we've heard that from the members opposite that we need to kind of look at our prioritization, that we're not talking about diversification, we're not actually investing in diversification. But I would say that when you look at the $6 million for innovation infrastructure maintenance, which provides Alberta Innovates, Innotech Alberta and the Alberta Centre for Advanced Micro and Nanotech projects, with the ability to maintain, renew aging infrastructure and unique testing facilities for later scaling and commercialization of Alberta-based technologies, we do feel and we do see the importance of diversification as we continue to move forward. With that, we also see the importance of taking care of our seniors through our continuing care investment, $3.5 billion in continuing care, an increase over $200 million to support our seniors. Now, when we make these investments, all of these investments that I just spoke about do exactly that. They create jobs, they pre-position us, they create an environment for us to have that growth. And when we talk about the bank saying, the Premier has spoke multiple times that many banks like BMO have said that we are the jurisdiction that's going to see the quickest, fastest recovery and growth. And investing in this provides us the infrastructure to grow beyond what we were even before this, while creating jobs and supporting the province through this. Now, like I said, doing so will create the opportunity for Alberta's largest employing industries to maintain their pathway to recovery, which will ultimately help Albertans get employed and will protect their families and their livelihoods. Our province knows the importance of being prepared and adaptable for unfortunate situations and sudden economic recessions that continue of the global pandemic and our instability in oil and gas. And we talk about this $500 million dedicated to our economic recovery plan as a contingency to provide a flexible plan.
Thank you,
Mr.
Honourable
Speaker.
Member. I hesitate to interrupt the Honourable Member for Highwood, but in accordance with Standing Order 64 sub 5, the Chair is required to put the question on the appropriation bill standing on the order paper for third reading. On Bill 60, Appropriation Act 2021, all those in favour of the motion for third reading, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. I believe the ayes have it. That is carried and so ordered. However, a division has been called. Call in the members. Thank you, honorable members. A division has been called on the motion for third reading of Bill 60, Appropriation Act 2021. All those in favor of the motion for third reading, please rise and be counted.
The Honourable Mr. Kenny, the Honourable Mr. Copping, the Honourable Mrs. Savage, the Honourable Mr. Nixon, the Honourable Mr. Taves, the Honourable Mrs. Ahir, the Honourable Mr. Dreeshen, the Honourable Mr. Nicolaides, Mr. Lowen, the Honourable Mr. Madu, Mr. Amory, Ms. Isaac, Mr. Ellis, Mr. Scow, the Honourable Mr. Nally, Ms. Lovely, the Honourable Mr. Panda, Mr. Nixon, Mr. Horner, Mr. Yassin, Mr. Newdorf, Ms. Furr, Mr. Williams, Mrs. Allard, Mr. Tour, Ms. Armstrong-Homenuk, Mr. Sigurdsson, Mr. Barnes, Mr. Smith, Mr. Long, Ms. Goodridge, Mr. Van Dyken, and Mr. Jones.
Thank you, honorable members. All those members opposed to the motion for third reading of Bill 60, Appropriation Act 2021, please rise and be counted.
Mr. Egan, Mr. Sabier, Ms. Sweet, Mr. Diol, Member Carson, Mr. Billis, Mr. Shepherd, and Ms. Goring.
Mr. Speaker, total for the motion, 33, total against 8.
Thank you, honorable members. That is carried and so ordered.
Bill 60 Appropriation Act 2021 is now read a third time.
And pursuant to Standing Orders 3.6, 3 sub 6, and 4 sub 2, the Assembly now stands adjourned until Tuesday, April 6th at 1:30 p.m.